Hey guys, tonight we are traveling to a place so cold that the air itself becomes your enemy. A place where your breath doesn't just mist. It crackles, freezes mid-fall, and tinkles against the ground in tiny ice crystals with a sound the locals call the whisper of the stars. A place where, if you stepped outside right now without the right gear, you would have somewhere between 3 and 7 minutes before your body began making some very permanent decisions on your behalf. You probably won't survive this, at least not without a crash course in about 10,000 years of accumulated human wisdom. But here, nestled in the great eastern sprawl of Siberia, the people of Yakutia have not only survived, they have built homes, raised children, kept horses, told jokes, and fallen asleep under skies so clear and so mercilessly cold that the stars look like shards of broken glass scattered across black velvet. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love reading those. Someone once told me they watched from a submarine. I have no reason to doubt them. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing, mercifully hypothetically, somewhere in the Sakha Republic, which is the formal modern name for the vast territory most of the world still calls Yakutia. It is the largest federal subject of Russia, which itself is the largest country on Earth, so you are essentially standing in the largest subdivision of the largest thing on the map. Size out here is almost a philosophical concept. Yakutia alone covers more than 3 million square kilometers. To give you a sense of scale that your sleepy brain can actually process, you could fit India inside Yakutia and still have room left over for a country or two. You could fit all of Western Europe in here and lose it. The land just keeps going, taiga forests that stretch for days, river systems so vast they'd be considered inland seas in more modest geographies, and then, eventually, nothing. Just frozen ground, frozen sky, and the occasional reindeer looking at you with the kind of quiet judgment only an animal perfectly adapted to its environment can muster. But we're not here for the reindeer just yet. We're here for the cold. Specifically, we're here for what it means to live, genuinely, generationally, stubbornly live, in temperatures that can plunge to minus 71 degrees Celsius. That's minus 95.8 degrees Fahrenheit for those of you keeping score at home. That is colder than the surface of Mars on an average day. Let that sink in. Mars, the planet. The one we keep talking about colonizing as though it's a fun adventure rather than a terrifying act of desperation. Yakutia gets colder than that, regularly every winter, and people there wake up in the morning, make tea, and go to work. To understand what minus 71 actually does to a human body, you need to abandon everything your comfortable, centrally heated existence has taught you about cold. You know cold as an inconvenience, a reason to grab a jacket, to complain about the commute, to order another blanket from an online retailer at 2 in the morning. The cold of Yakutia is not an inconvenience. It is a presence. It has weight and intention. It presses against every window, creeps under every door, and waits with the patience of something very old and very indifferent for any gap in your defenses. When the temperature drops below minus 40, and in Yakutia, minus 40 is practically a mild spell, a brief flirtation with warmth, the physics of everyday life begin to shift. Metal contracts so violently that structural bolts in buildings can shear clean off without warning. Rubber loses its elasticity and becomes brittle as old ceramic. Car tires, if left outside overnight, develop flat spots that take kilometers of slow driving to work out. Assuming the engine starts at all, which is its own adventure. Diesel fuel gels into something closer to candle wax. Hydraulic systems in machinery simply stop functioning. The world you thought you understood, the world of reliable physical properties and predictable materials, quietly resigns and hands in its notice. Your body, meanwhile, is doing something rather extraordinary. At the first hint of extreme cold, your cardiovascular system begins a process called vasoconstriction. It pulls blood away from your extremities and concentrates it around your vital organs. Your fingers and toes get the message last, as they always do in any organizational hierarchy. They go numb first, then white. Then, if you ignore the warning long enough, they start to develop that peculiar waxy, hard texture that field medics in cold climates learn to recognize with grim efficiency. Frostbite is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It arrives quietly, like a very polite catastrophe. At -71, any exposed skin, can begin experiencing frostbite in under a minute. Not 5 minutes. Not 3. Under 1 minute. This is why the people of Yakutia, across centuries of lived experience and hard-won cultural knowledge, developed an almost ritualistic relationship with their clothing. But we'll get to that in proper detail later, because the wardrobe situation out here genuinely deserves its own extended conversation. For now, consider the air itself. At extreme cold, the moisture in your breath freezes almost instantly upon exhalation. This is the phenomenon behind the whisper of the stars, called pagoda podoroznik in some Siberian traditions, though the exact naming varies by region, which historians still argue whether the terminology was consistent across pre-colonial Yakutian communities or developed independently in isolated villages. Whatever you call it, the effect is the same. You breathe out and you hear your own breath die in the air around you. It is, by all accounts, simultaneously one of the most beautiful and most unsettling sounds a human being can experience. Beautiful because it's unlike anything in your normal world. Unsettling because it's a very direct, very personal reminder that the atmosphere has become hostile to your continued existence. There's a quirky fringe detail about this temperature range that researchers in atmospheric physics find genuinely fascinating. At around -70, the air in Yakutia becomes so dense and so still that sound travels differently. Local residents have reported hearing conversations from distances that should, by normal acoustic physics, make them inaudible. Some Yakutian oral traditions describe this as the land listening. Scientists attribute it to temperature inversion layers that create unusual acoustic ducting effects. The land listening is probably more poetic. But science and poetry are both just languages for describing the same bewildering world, so perhaps both are right. The Sakha Republic sits almost entirely above the Arctic Circle, and a significant portion of it lies within the zone of continuous permafrost, meaning the ground beneath your feet has been frozen without interruption for tens of thousands of years. This isn't seasonal frost that thaws in spring and refreezes in autumn. This is permanent, geological, ancient ice locked into the soil so deeply that drilling operations for infrastructure have to account for it at depths of hundreds of meters. The permafrost goes down, in some parts of Yakutia, over 1.5 kilometers. That's deeper than many mines. The ground here has a memory that predates human civilization by a comfortable margin, and it does not particularly care about your building codes. The climate that creates this frozen world operates on a principle of extremes that would seem almost theatrical if it weren't entirely real. Yakutia experiences what meteorologists classify as a subarctic climate with extreme continental characteristics, meaning the summers and winters are not just different seasons, they are different worlds. In summer, which comes briefly and with an almost desperate enthusiasm, temperatures can reach 38 or even 40 degrees Celsius. You read that correctly. The same place that hits -71 in winter can hit +40 in summer. That is a temperature range of over 110 degrees Celsius between the seasonal extremes. No other continuously inhabited region on Earth experiences anything close to this. It is, in purely meteorological terms, the most extreme seasonal temperature range on the planet, and it has shaped every single aspect of life here, biological, cultural, architectural, psychological, in ways we are only beginning to fully appreciate. What causes this? The short answer is geography. Yakutia sits in a vast continental interior, far from any moderating oceanic influence. In winter, cold Arctic air masses settle into the low-lying basins of the Lena River Valley and its tributaries, and because cold air is dense, it sinks and stays. There's very little wind to mix the air masses or bring any temperate influence. The cold just pools, deepens, intensifies, and sits there for months with the smug permanence of a house guest who has read all your books and eaten all your food and shows absolutely no signs of leaving. It's worth pausing here, and we'll do this gently because we're easing towards sleep, not running a marathon, to appreciate what -71 actually represents in human terms. The record low for Yakutia, recorded at the town of Verkhoyansk in 1892, was -67.8 Celsius. A competing record from the nearby settlement of Oymyakon, recorded in 1933, clocked in at -67.7. though some sources cite readings as low as -71.2. The exact figure is debated, records from the 1930s being what they were, kept under Soviet administrative conditions that were not always optimized for scientific precision. But the consensus is that both places have experienced temperatures colder than anywhere else on Earth outside of Antarctica and high-altitude polar stations. And unlike Antarctic research bases, which are staffed by rotating crews of specially trained personnel with extensive logistical support, Oymyakon and Verkhoyansk are towns, with schools, and post offices, and people who have grandchildren and favorite recipes and petty disagreements with their neighbors about where exactly the property line runs. This is the central, quietly astonishing fact at the heart of tonight's story. Human beings chose to live here, chose over generations to stay, to adapt, to find not just survival but meaning, beauty, humor, and home in a place that the laws of thermodynamics seem to have specifically designated as uninhabitable. The Yakutian people, and we'll meet them properly soon, because their story is one of the most remarkable in human history, did not simply endure the cold. They learned its language. They built a civilization in conversation with it. And that, in itself, is enough to keep the lights on in the human story for a good long while yet. The temperature outside your imaginary window in Yakutia is dropping now as the last thin light of the winter sun, which rises late, arches low, and sets early, never climbing high enough to offer any meaningful warmth, fades below the horizon. The sky goes through a brief, extravagant performance of pinks and purples before settling into a deep, clear, ink-black dark scattered with more stars than you've probably ever seen in your life. The Milky Way out here is not a vague smear. It is a road, a structure, something you feel you could almost navigate by. Your breath whispers and crackles. The snow underfoot compresses with a squeak that's different from the soft crunch of warmer snow. This is a dry, almost musical sound, the sound of ice crystals being forced into new arrangements. Everything is very still. The cold has a way of quieting the world, of pressing down on sound and movement alike, of creating a silence so complete and so textured that it almost becomes its own kind of noise. And somewhere nearby, in a low house built close to the ground to keep as much heat in as possible, a light is on. Someone is making tea. Someone is feeding a stove. Someone has lived here all their life and will live here all their life still, and they are, in this moment, perfectly, incomprehensibly at home. I need to continue to reach 3,000 to 3,500 words. Let me continue the section seamlessly. The question that naturally rises in a mind drifting toward sleep, a warm mind, a comfortable mind, a mind that has not spent a single night outside at -50, is why? Why here? Why stay? Why build? Why not pack up whatever you can carry and walk south until the air stops trying to kill you? The answer, as with most things in human geography, is complicated and multilayered and involves a mixture of necessity, attachment, accumulated knowledge, and the particular human stubbornness that has always been both our greatest flaw and our most spectacular feature. But a significant part of the answer is also simply this: by the time the people who would become the Yakuts arrived here, they already knew how to survive. They had the tools. They had the knowledge. They had the animals. And over generations, what began as survival calculus became something else entirely. Became love, became identity, became a relationship with a landscape so profound and so particular that leaving it would mean leaving yourself behind. But let's not get ahead of the story. There will be time for identity and belonging and the deep cultural roots of the Saka people. For now, let's stay with the cold a little longer, because the cold demands a certain respect, a certain attentiveness, that we do well to practice before moving on. One of the things that surprises people most when they learn about life in extreme cold is that the danger is not always obvious. You'd think that -70 would feel like -70, that the danger would be self-evident, screaming, impossible to ignore, and in some ways it is. But hypothermia, the real existential threat, is deceptive. As your core body temperature begins to drop, and it doesn't need to drop far, a decrease of just 2 degrees Celsius from your normal 37 puts you into mild hypothermia. Something strange happens to your judgment. You begin to feel warmer. This is not a metaphor. It is a documented, physiological, terrifying reality. At a certain stage of hypothermia, patients experience what is called paradoxical undressing, in which they begin to feel intensely hot and remove their clothing. This has been found in hypothermia victims discovered outdoors, and for years it baffled investigators. Now we understand it as a malfunction of the nerves controlling blood vessel dilation. The vasoconstriction that was keeping your core warm suddenly releases, flooding your skin with blood and creating a false sensation of heat even as your core temperature plummets. The body, in its final desperate moments, tricks itself. It is one of the more poignant ironies of human biology. The people of Yakutia learned, across centuries, not to trust their feelings in the cold. This is both practical wisdom and a kind of philosophy. Don't trust how you feel. Trust the rules. Trust the system. Trust the knowledge your grandparents gave you. The cold teaches you, if you're willing to learn, that sensation is not always truth, that the most dangerous moments are sometimes the ones that feel the safest. There's something almost meditative about that, when you sit with it in the warm dark before sleep. The discipline of not trusting the feeling that everything is fine. The practice of following the inherited wisdom even when your immediate experience contradicts it. It's a lesson the frozen ground has been teaching people here for 10,000 years, and it is, perhaps, one worth carrying gently into whatever tomorrow brings. Outside, the temperature is still falling. It will continue falling until somewhere in the deep hours before dawn, when it reaches its daily minimum, the coldest point of the coldest hours, and then, almost imperceptibly, begin its long climb back toward a daytime high that might, if the season is cooperating, reach -40, which is, out here, practically a reason to open a window. The stars don't move. The silence holds. The ice remembers everything. And you, somewhere warm and horizontal, are just beginning to feel the first soft pull of sleep at the edges of your consciousness. Good. Let it come. We've only just started, and there is so much more to see. The ground beneath Yakutia is not simply frozen. It is ancient in a way that makes the word ancient feel inadequate, like calling the Pacific Ocean a bit damp. The permafrost that locks this land in its permanent cold embrace began forming somewhere between 2 and 3 million years ago, during the great Pleistocene glaciations that reshaped the face of the Earth with a thoroughness that no subsequent geological event has managed to match. 2 to 3 million years. For context, the entire recorded history of human civilization, every empire, every dynasty, every written word, every city that rose and fell and rose again, fits into roughly the last 5,000 years. The permafrost was already ancient before the first human being looked at a rock and thought, productively, about its potential uses. It has been here longer than our species. It will, in all likelihood, outlast most of what we've built. And it holds, locked inside its frozen depths, one of the most remarkable biological archives on the planet. You are thinking about the ground now, the ground that stretches beneath the imaginary snow under your imaginary feet, and it is doing something that ground in warmer latitudes simply doesn't do. It is preserving. The permafrost of Yakutia is essentially a natural deep freeze operating at scales and time depths that no human technology has ever replicated. Organic material that falls into permafrost, plant matter, animal remains, entire creatures in some cases, does not decay. It simply stops. Suspended. Waiting. The chemical processes of decomposition require liquid water and microbial activity. And in permanently frozen ground, both are arrested. What goes in stays in, sometimes for tens of thousands of years, in a state of preservation so complete that scientists recovering specimens from Yakutian permafrost have found muscle tissue still red, stomach contents still identifiable, fur still soft enough to stroke. The most famous residents of this frozen archive are, of course, the woolly mammoths. Mammuthus primigenius roamed the grasslands of Siberia, a vast, cold but productive ecosystem that paleontologists call the mammoth steppe, in enormous numbers until somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 years ago, when they disappeared in what remains one of the most discussed extinction events in paleontology. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of mammoth extinction was human hunting pressure, rapid climate change at the end of the Pleistocene, or some combination of both acting in a feedback loop, and the debate shows no signs of resolution, with new genetic and isotopic evidence regularly reshuffling the leading hypothesis. What is not in dispute is that the mammoths of Yakutia left themselves behind in extraordinary detail. Frozen mammoth specimens recovered from Yakutian permafrost have included animals so complete that the word fossil feels misleading. Fossils are mineralized, replaced, stone versions of the original. These are the originals. When researchers extracted a specimen now known as Yucca, a young female mammoth discovered in 2010 in the Sakha Republic, they found her preserved well enough to analyze her blood, her muscle proteins, and the partially digested contents of her last meal. She had been eating grass and flowers. She had reddish-brown hair. She was probably around 6 to 9 years old when she died, perhaps 10,000 years ago, and she looked, with the particular mix of the familiar and the profoundly strange that only deep time can produce, like something that had simply lain down for a very long nap. The discovery of preserved mammoth blood, actual liquid blood, surviving in ice pockets within the carcass despite tens of thousands of years, sent ripples through the scientific community that are still expanding. Because liquid blood means intact cells. Intact cells means intact DNA. And intact DNA means, at least theoretically, the possibility of resurrection. The de-extinction conversation around woolly mammoths has moved, in the last decade, from science fiction speculation to serious genomic engineering research, with at least one well-funded American biotechnology company publicly committed to producing a cold-adapted elephant-mammoth hybrid within the coming years. Whether this is a triumph of science or a profound category error, whether you can bring back something that belonged to a different world by inserting its genes into a creature of this one, is a question worth pondering in the quiet before sleep. Gently, without reaching for a firm conclusion. But the mammoths were not alone on the mammoth steppe. The Yakutia of 20,000 years ago was a place of startling biodiversity. Cold, yes, but productive, supporting vast herds of woolly rhinoceros, cave lions, giant deer, bison, horses, and the full complement of predators and scavengers that any rich ecosystem generates. The steppe itself, that cold grassland that covered much of northern Eurasia and connected, via the land bridge of Beringia to North America, was not the sparse, windswept wasteland that the word steppe might suggest. It was, by the estimates of paleobotanists reconstructing it from pollen records and sediment cores, more like a cold savanna. Grassy, grazed, maintained by the constant cropping of large herbivores in a way that kept it open and productive. The mammoths were not just residents of this ecosystem. They were engineers of it, their grazing and trampling and tusk work shaping the vegetation in ways that maintained the very conditions they needed to survive. Their extinction changed the landscape as much as the climate did. This is not merely ancient history. A small and determined group of scientists working from a research station in Yakutia called Pleistocene Park, which is, yes, absolutely a real place, and yes, the name was chosen with full awareness of the cultural reference, which is either admirably self-aware or quietly alarming depending on your relationship with Michael Crichton, has been attempting to restore something like the mammoth steppe ecosystem by reintroducing large grazing animals to the Siberian tundra. Bison, horses, reindeer, and musk oxen have been brought to the park with the idea that their grazing and ground-trampling behavior will begin to restore grassland conditions similar to those of the Pleistocene. The science behind the project is genuinely interesting. Large herbivores compact the snow in winter, which reduces its insulating effect and allows the deep cold to penetrate further into the permafrost, potentially slowing the thaw that climate change is now accelerating. Grazing animals also stimulate grass growth, which reflects more sunlight in summer than the mosses and shrubs that currently dominate the tundra. It is, in a very real sense, an attempt to use ancient ecology as a climate tool. Whether it works at the scale needed is, again, a question that honest science answers with "we're not sure yet." But the attempt itself says something rather beautiful about human ingenuity, and perhaps something slightly concerning about our tendency to reach for complicated solutions when simpler ones are politically inconvenient. Let the mammoths wander gently through the back of your mind for a moment. Let them be enormous and slow and improbably well adapted. Their long curved tusks raking through snow to find the grasses beneath. Their thick underlayers of wool and fat holding the cold at bay with an efficiency that any Yakutian elder would recognize and respect. They were very good at being alive in this place. And then they weren't, and the place continued. Because the land, as it turns out, has an extraordinary talent for continuing. The geological story of Yakutia goes back much further than the mammoths. Much further, in fact, than any megafauna at all. The bedrock of the Sakha Republic includes some of the oldest exposed rock on Earth. Portions of the Siberian Craton, the ancient stable core of the Asian continent, date to over 3 billion years in age. 3 billion years. The universe itself is only about 13.8 billion years old. so the rocks beneath Yakutia have been around for roughly a fifth of the universe's entire existence. They were old when the first single-celled life was experimenting tentatively with the concept of multicellularity. They have outlasted every extinction event, every ice age, every reshuffling of the continents by the slow conveyor belt of plate tectonics. These ancient rocks are significant for a reason beyond their sheer geological grandeur, though the grandeur alone seems worth a moment's appreciation before sleep. The Siberian Craton is extraordinarily rich in minerals deposited over billions of years of geological activity: diamonds, gold, rare earth elements, coal, and, more recently discovered in terms of extraction technology, vast reserves of oil and natural gas. The diamonds of Yakutia, formed under the immense pressures of ancient geological events including, intriguingly, a massive asteroid impact that created the Papagai crater in what is now northern Siberia about 35 million years ago, are among the most significant diamond deposits on Earth. The Papagai impact diamonds being a distinct type formed by the shock metamorphism of graphite-bearing rocks, are estimated to be so numerous that they exceed all known conventional diamond deposits combined. They are not currently gem quality in the traditional sense, but their industrial applications are enormous. The Soviet Union discovered the Papagai deposits in the 1970s and, in one of history's more eccentric economic decisions, classified the entire find as a state secret rather than develop it. Partly because they didn't want to disrupt the global diamond market, and partly because Soviet bureaucratic priorities were not always optimized for straightforward logic. The deposit remained secret until the 1990s. You couldn't make this up. Or rather, you could, but people wouldn't believe you. The formation of the permafrost itself, that vast frozen archive that makes Yakutia what it is tied to the same planetary cooling trend that produced the Pleistocene ice ages. As global temperatures declined over the last several million years, the ground in the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere began to freeze not just seasonally but permanently, layer by layer, year by year, accumulating frozen depth in the way that an archive accumulates files. Steadily, without drama, until the storage is suddenly so vast it becomes its own kind of monument. The deepest permafrost in Yakutia, in some basins associated with ancient lake beds called alas, extends over 1,500 meters below the surface. The temperature of this deep permafrost, far below the reach of any seasonal or even millennial climate fluctuation, hovers around -10 to -15 Celsius, where it has remained essentially unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years. But here is the detail that should perhaps keep you slightly less comfortable than you're currently feeling, before sleep claims you entirely. The permafrost is thawing. Not quickly by human timescales of daily experience, but measurably, detectably, and, to the scientists who study it, worryingly. As global temperatures rise, the active layer of permafrost, the uppermost portion that normally thaws in summer and refreezes in winter, is becoming thicker. In some regions of Yakutia, buildings that were constructed on permafrost foundations that were expected to remain stable for the lifetime of the structure are tilting, sinking, and cracking as the ground beneath them loses its structural integrity. Roads buckle, pipelines shift. The landscape itself begins to change in ways that have no precedent in the human occupation of this territory. When permafrost thaws, it releases the organic material that has been locked inside it, and that organic material, after 10,000 or 50,000 years of freezer storage, begins at last to decompose. Decomposition, in wet, oxygen-poor conditions, produces methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas roughly 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year time frame. The permafrost of Siberia contains an estimated 1.5 trillion tons of organic carbon. If even a fraction of this thaws and decomposes at accelerated rates, the feedback loop this creates, thawing permafrost releasing greenhouse gases that warm the atmosphere that thaws more permafrost, is one of the scenarios that climate scientists discuss with the particular kind of careful, measured language that people use when they don't want to cause a panic but also genuinely believe a panic might be warranted. None of which, it should be said, is particularly conducive to falling asleep. So let's file that gently in the important but not immediately actionable at 11:30 on a weeknight drawer of your mind and return to the beautiful, ancient, patient landscape of Yakutia as it was, and still largely is, before the complications of the modern world added their particular flavor to the story. In winter, the alas, those distinctive depressions in the permafrost landscape formed by the thawing and refreezing of ground ice over centuries, fill with snow and become smooth white bowls of extraordinary quiet. They are a characteristic feature of the Yakutian landscape, and the Saka people who would come to inhabit this land found them extraordinarily useful. Sheltered from the wind, often with access to fresh water in summer, and offering a microclimate slightly warmer than the exposed plains, the Alas became natural sites for settlement and agriculture. The landscape, in other words, offered solutions to the very problems it posed, if you were willing to read it carefully enough, to spend enough time in conversation with it to understand its logic. And this brings us, gently and almost inevitably, to the human story that runs through all of this ancient geography like a thread of warmth through permafrost. Because the land, for all its extraordinary age and geological drama, is most interesting, most alive in the way that matters to a storytelling species like ours, when people are standing on it, looking at it, learning it, loving it, eventually, in the particular way that only comes from a relationship long enough and deep enough to leave marks on both parties. The mammoths are gone. The ancient sea that once covered parts of this basin has been frozen memory for millions of years. The asteroid that made the diamond crater hit and the dust settled and the centuries moved on. And into this landscape, at some point in the not-so-ancient past, 10,000 years, 15,000, the exact timing is still being refined by archaeologists working in conditions that would make most of their colleagues in warmer latitudes weep into their thermos flasks, came the first human beings. They arrived from the south and west, following the river valleys, following the herds, following the ancient human impulse to see what was over the next ridge. They were not looking for hardship. Nobody goes looking for hardship. But they found this land, and they found that it could support life. Their life, specifically, if they were clever and careful and willing to learn. And they stayed. The stars above Yakutia tonight. Tonight in our story. Tonight in the imaginary winter dark that we're inhabiting together. Are the same stars that those first arrivals looked up at. Different constellations named in different languages, perhaps. Different stories told about the same lights. But the same cold, the same silence, the same improbable, magnificent sense that a human being, standing here under the sky, is somehow exactly where a human being is supposed to be. The ground remembers them. The permafrost holds their traces, their charcoal hearths, their animal bones, their careful stone tools, in the same archive that holds the mammoths and the ancient pollen and the diamonds and the deep geological time. Everything here is preserved. Everything here persists. And now the land waits, as it always has, patient and enormous and fundamentally unconcerned with the question of whether we're adequately dressed for the occasion. The Saka people, who call themselves Saka, though the world has long known them by the Russian name Yakut, a label that arrived with outsiders and stuck with the particular tenacity of labels that do, did not emerge from this landscape. They arrived into it, which is a different thing entirely, and the distinction matters. They came as strangers to one of the most hostile environments on Earth, and they became, across generations of extraordinarily deliberate adaptation, something that no longer made sense anywhere else. This is a pattern you see repeated across human history in the most extreme environments our species has chosen to inhabit, the Arctic, the high Andes, the deep Sahara, but nowhere is the transformation more complete, more total, more quietly astonishing than in Yakutia. The Saka did not just survive the cold. They became cold-weather people in their bones, their culture, their language, their dreams. The origins of the Saka are a matter of both scholarly investigation and living oral tradition, and the two accounts agree on more than you might expect. The mainstream historical consensus, built from linguistic analysis, genetic studies, and archaeological evidence, places the ancestral Saka in the Lake Baikal region of southern Siberia, far to the south and west of modern Yakutia, in a landscape that, while certainly not tropical, is a universe away from the pole of cold. The Saka language belongs to the Turkic language family, which connects it to languages spoken from Turkey across Central Asia to the Altai Mountains, a linguistic geography that reflects a migration history stretching back over many centuries, sometime between the 9th and 14th centuries CE. The exact timeline is actively debated among Siberian historians, with estimates shifting as new archaeological sites are excavated and new genetic analyses completed. The ancestors of the modern Saka began moving northward along the Lena River, driven by a combination of factors that history's messiness makes difficult to disentangle cleanly: pressure from Mongol expansion, conflict with neighboring peoples, the lure of new grazing, territory, or simply the restless human hunger for somewhere new. Historians still argue whether this migration was a single organized movement or a series of smaller, sequential waves of related groups who gradually coalesced into a common identity as they settled the Lena Basin. The genetic evidence suggests the latter, that the people who became the Saka absorbed and were absorbed by the indigenous Tungusic and Yukagir peoples already living in the region, creating a new ethnicity that was genuinely composite rather than simply transplanted. This kind of cultural and genetic mixing, happening over centuries in a remote landscape that discouraged outside interference, produced something new. Not the steppe horsemen of the south, not the forest hunters of the Tungus. Something that was both and neither, a people built precisely for this particular place. What they brought with them from the south was, in the context of survival at extreme latitudes, almost absurdly valuable. Horses, cattle, a sophisticated pastoral culture built around the careful management of livestock through long winters. A tradition of working with leather and fur that was already highly developed before it encountered the truly extreme cold of the Lena Basin. A social structure organized around extended kin groups that could cooperate through resource scarcity with the kind of disciplined mutual support that individualism simply cannot sustain in a -60 winter. They brought, in other words, the toolkit for survival not yet calibrated for Yakutia's specific extremes, but adaptable. Brilliantly, stubbornly adaptable. The adaptation, when it came, was comprehensive. The Saka modified every piece of their material culture to suit the demands of the northern environment. Their horses, already a cold-adapted breed from the Baikal steppe, became, over generations of selective breeding and natural selection, the Yakutian horse. A compact, thick-legged, extraordinarily hardy animal with a coat that grows to extraordinary thickness in winter and a metabolic efficiency that allows it to survive on meager forage by pawing through snow. The Yakutian horse can maintain its body weight and energy levels through a Yakutian winter on food sources that would leave other domestic horses in serious trouble. It doesn't pace itself dramatically or make a production of its survival. It simply gets on with it, with the bovine practicality of an animal that has been doing this for a very long time and doesn't see what all the fuss is about. The cattle, too, the Yakutian cattle breed, known locally as the Saka ox, developed cold adaptations over centuries that set them apart from any other domestic cattle on Earth. They grow a thick winter coat more similar to a bison than a conventional dairy cow. They can calve successfully at temperatures that would kill a Holstein or an Angus. Their milk, produced in the depths of winter when every calorie counts, has a higher fat content than most other breeds. A biological adaptation to the energy demands of cold weather lactation that also happens to make it extraordinarily rich and nourishing for the humans who depend on it. Yakutian cattle are, by most measures, the most cold-tolerant domestic cattle in existence, and they are, rather heartbreakingly, now considered a rare breed. Soviet-era collectivization policies that we'll discuss in more detail later push their numbers down dramatically in favor of higher yield but far less hardy imported breeds, and the recovery of the traditional Saka cattle population has been slow and complicated. But let's not jump ahead. Let's stay in the earlier centuries, in the centuries of arrival and adaptation and the slow, extraordinary process of a people becoming native to a place that should not, by any reasonable thermodynamic accounting, support human life at all. The Saka settled most densely in the central Yakutian lowland, the broad, flat valley of the Middle Lena River and its tributaries, where the Alas provided sheltered, resource-rich pockets in the vast expanse of taiga and tundra. Here they built their traditional winter dwellings, called Balagan low, earthbank structures of logs and clay, designed with a genius for heat retention that no visiting architect from warmer latitudes has ever failed to admire once they understand the principles involved. The Balagan sits low to the ground to minimize its exposure to wind. Its walls are thick, insulated with a mix of clay and manure and turf that creates a composite material of remarkable thermal resistance. The floor is often set slightly below ground level, taking advantage of the Earth's own residual warmth, or rather, taking advantage of the fact that in a -50 world, even the 0-degree temperature of the deep soil represents a significant improvement over the ambient air. The roof is steeply pitched and also earthed over. The single window, traditionally, faced south to capture what little winter sun there was, and was covered not with glass, which was expensive and fragile and arrived with Russian traders much later, but with a stretched membrane of the stomach lining of a large fish or animal, which admitted light while blocking wind. Inside the Balagan in deep winter, the temperature hovered around 5 to 10 degrees Celsius above zero. not exactly tropical but livable and achievable entirely through the heat generated by the inhabitants, their animals, and a small hearth burning a relatively modest amount of wood. The efficiency is extraordinary. Modern building engineers who have analyzed traditional Balagan construction have found that the combination of low-profile, thick insulated walls, low thermal bridging construction methods, and animal cohabitation. The livestock were often kept in an adjacent section of the building, their body heat contributing passively to the overall thermal budget, created a passive heating system of genuine sophistication. The Saka did not have thermodynamics as a formal science. They had centuries of iterative trial and error, and the feedback mechanism for getting it wrong was immediate, absolute, and non-negotiable. You can't help but appreciate the elegance of learning systems that have those kinds of consequences. There are no half measures in a Yakutian winter. The building either works or it doesn't, and if it doesn't, the people inside it don't get to submit a warranty claim. The spiritual life of the Saka, the belief system that held their world together and gave meaning to the extraordinary conditions of their existence, centered on a tradition called Tengrism, a shamanic religion shared with many Central Asian and Siberian peoples but elaborated in the Yakutian context into something distinctly its own. The cosmos, in Saka spiritual understanding, is layered. An upper world of benevolent sky spirits, a middle world of everyday human and natural life, and a lower world of more ambiguous and potentially dangerous powers. The boundary between these layers is permeable, and the shaman, the Ayun in the Saka tradition, is the specialist in crossing those boundaries, in negotiating with the powers of the upper and lower worlds on behalf of the community. The Saka shaman occupied a social role that was simultaneously medical practitioner, psychologist, community mediator, environmental interpreter, and performing artist. The Ayun's rituals, complex, physically demanding, often hours-long performances involving distinctive costume dress hung with metal pendants that created an extraordinary soundscape as the shaman moved, beat a large frame drum, sang in registers that could shift between registers with unnerving fluidity, and entered altered states that the Saka understood as genuine travel between worlds, were central to community health and cohesion in a way that no single modern professional role quite captures. You'd need to combine your doctor, your therapist, your priest, your weather forecaster, and your community theater director to come close. The relationship between the Saka spiritual worldview and their natural environment was not symbolic or metaphorical in the way that might occur to a modern secular observer. It was, for the people living it, literal and practical. The spirits of the rivers and the forests and the sky were not poetic abstractions. They were entities with agency, preferences, and the capacity for both assistance and harm. A shaman was consulted before a major hunt, before a long journey, before any significant undertaking that placed a person in intimate contact with the non-human world. The cold itself, the extreme, life-defining cold, was understood as having personality, as being a manifestation of spiritual forces that could be engaged with through proper ritual and behavior. There is something in this that modern cognitive science finds genuinely interesting rather than simply quaint. The Saka worldview created a framework in which paying close attention to environmental signals was not just practical wisdom but spiritual obligation. Noticing the way ice was forming on a river, reading the behavior of animals, interpreting cloud formations and wind directions, these were not merely survivalist skills. They were acts of relationship with a living world. Whether or not the spirits are real in the way the Saka understood them, the epistemological habit of attentive, humble, relational engagement with the environment produced people who were extraordinarily good at reading it. And in an environment like Yakutia's, being good at reading your surroundings is the difference between going home and not going home. The Saka oral tradition, their epic poetry, their songs, their folk narratives, is another dimension of this profound environmental attunement. The Elanco, the great Saka heroic epic, is a vast, sprawling oral literary work that UNESCO recognized in 2005 as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. Elanco performances by traditional singer-storytellers could last for multiple nights, the epic being too long for a single sitting, which seems, if you think about it, like an entirely appropriate way to organize a story cycle in a culture where winter nights last nearly 24 hours and there is a very practical need to fill the darkness with something warm and human and alive. The Elanco is not simply entertainment. It encodes geography, moral philosophy, social norms, historical memory, and spiritual instruction in a form that could be carried entirely in a human mind and transmitted across generations without a single written word. The Saka had no indigenous writing system before contact with Russian civilization. Their entire cultural knowledge, everything they knew about survival, about the land, about the spirit world, about their own history, lived in human memory and human voice. This is not a deficiency. It is a different technology of knowledge preservation, and one with its own extraordinary features. Oral traditions are dynamic. They adapt to new circumstances without losing their core wisdom. They are distributed. Knowledge doesn't disappear with the destruction of a single library or server. They require active human relationship to maintain. You can only transmit an oral tradition by being in the presence of another person, by listening and speaking, by the kind of attentive, embodied engagement that reading a book or scrolling through a website specifically doesn't require. The Elanco survived Russian colonization, Soviet repression, forced collectivization, and the entire 20th century largely because it lived in people rather than on paper, and people are, in many ways, harder to destroy than documents. When Russian Cossack explorers and traders began pushing into the Lena Basin in the early 17th century, they found the Saka already fully established, a numerous, organized, culturally sophisticated people with a complex social hierarchy, well-developed trade networks, and a relationship with their land so deep that Russian colonial administration took over 2 centuries to significantly disrupt it. The Cossacks, arriving with firearms and the administrative machinery of the Tsarist state, imposed a fur tax, the yasak, on the indigenous peoples of Siberia, demanding payment in the pelts of sable, fox, and beaver that were enormously valuable in the markets of Moscow and beyond. The Saka, like most Siberian peoples, had little choice but to comply. But compliance is not surrender, and the Saka demonstrated, over the long centuries of Russian and then Soviet rule, a talent for cultural persistence that is nothing short of remarkable. They kept their language. Saka remains a living language today, spoken by several 100,000 people, with an active literary tradition, a television presence, and a growing movement of cultural revitalization among young Saka people who are finding, in the digital age, new ways to carry an ancient knowledge forward. They kept their spiritual traditions, which went underground during the Soviet period. Shamanism was actively suppressed. Shamans were sometimes arrested or killed. Religious practice was officially discouraged, and emerged after the Soviet collapse with a vitality that surprised even those who had been quietly maintaining the traditions through the dark years. They kept their food, their music, their stories, their sense of who they were in relation to the land that had shaped them. And they kept the cold. Or rather, the cold kept them. Kept them the way the permafrost keeps everything. Suspended, preserved, fundamentally unchanged in the ways that matter most, even as the surface world transformed around them. Outside the balagan of your imagination, the Yakutian winter night is in full voice. The cold has that quality it gets in the deep hours, not aggressive exactly, but present in a way that demands acknowledgement. The stars are very bright and very still. An owl, somewhere in the birch forest at the edge of the Alas, produces a sound that the cold carries a remarkable distance, clear and clean as a bell. The horses in their enclosure shift and breathe, their exhalations rising in small clouds that freeze and fall. Inside, the hearth holds its warmth with the quiet competence of something that has been doing this for a very long time. A grandmother in the corner of the balagan is murmuring something low and rhythmic. It might be a prayer. It might be a verse from the Elanco. It might be the particular lullaby she learned from her grandmother, who learned it from hers, in an unbroken chain of voice and warmth that runs back through the generations to a time when the mammoths were still walking and the permafrost was still young and the first human eyes were looking at this landscape and deciding, against all reasonable odds, to stay. The cold does not argue with her. The cold has learned, over 10,000 years, that arguing with the Saka is not a productive use of anyone's time. Food in Yakutia is not a casual subject. It is not the kind of topic you bring up lightly over dinner, or rather, it is exactly the kind of topic you bring up over dinner because dinner here has been, for most of Yakutia's human history, a matter of genuine existential consequence rather than preference or pleasure. This is not to say the Saka don't enjoy their food. They absolutely do, with the particular relish of people who understand at a cellular level what it means to need something. But the relationship between the Saka and their food, how they raised it, hunted it, caught it, stored it, prepared it, and thought about it, is so deeply interwoven with the logic of survival in extreme cold that separating culinary culture from survival strategy is essentially impossible. The food is the strategy. The strategy is the food. And the freezer in Yakutia is literally everywhere. Consider your situation. You are a Saka pastoralist in, let's say, the 16th century. You have cattle and horses. You have a small summer garden where you can grow a handful of cold-tolerant root vegetables during the brief, furious growing season, which lasts, depending on your location, somewhere between 60 and 90 days, during which the sun barely sets and the ground thaws just enough in its uppermost layers to permit cultivation. You have the river, which in summer provides fish in extraordinary abundance and in winter provides fish through a hole in the ice, assuming you can keep the hole from freezing over faster than you can fish through it. And you have the taiga, which provides game elk, reindeer, bear, hare, grouse, and a dozen other species that have solved the problem of Yakutian winter in their own particular ways and whose solutions, when consumed, transfer some portion of their cold weather adaptation directly to you in the form of calories and fat and protein. The challenge is not finding food in summer. Summer, brief and almost frantic in its productivity, provides abundantly. The challenge, the central, organizing, architectural challenge of Saka food culture, is preserving enough of summer's abundance to last through a winter that can stretch to 8 or 9 months. 8 or 9 months of temperatures ranging from manageable to lethal, during which hunting is possible but difficult. Fishing requires specialized knowledge and equipment, and the garden is buried under a meter of snow that won't budge until May. The solution, as with so many things in Yakutia, was provided by the land itself. When the ambient temperature outside is -50, you don't need a refrigerator. You need a hole. The traditional Saka food storage pit, dug into the permafrost, which maintains a constant temperature of around -5 to -10 Celsius at depth regardless of what the air above is doing, is one of the most elegant pieces of food technology ever devised. Predates mechanical refrigeration by centuries. It requires no energy input. It maintains a stable, ideal preservation temperature year-round. It is, in purely functional terms, a better freezer than most of the ones humming quietly in your kitchen right now. Historians still argue whether the permafrost storage pit was developed independently by the Saka or adapted from techniques observed in other Siberian cultures. The Yukagir and Evenki peoples of the region had their own traditions of ground cold storage, but whoever refined it, the result was a food preservation system of extraordinary effectiveness. Meat stored in permafrost pits does not freeze burn the way commercially frozen meat does, because the temperature is stable rather than subject to the cycling of a compressor-driven system. Fish stored in permafrost maintains its texture and flavor with an integrity that commercial freezing cannot replicate. The Saka, if they were being honest about it, have been making better use of cold preservation technology than modern industrial food systems for approximately 10 centuries. This is the kind of fact that tends to make food scientists either slightly uncomfortable or extremely enthusiastic, depending on their relationship with received wisdom. The centerpiece of Saka animal husbandry, the beating heart of the food system, the creature around which so much of the culture was organized, was the horse. Not primarily as a working animal, though the Yakutian horse is that too, and a spectacularly capable one. As food, the Yakutian horse, with its extraordinary capacity to survive a northern winter on minimal forage, provided the Saka with a self-sustaining protein source that could maintain itself through conditions that would require a farming community elsewhere to import feed from thousands of miles away. The horse fed itself on roughage it found by pawing through snow, a behavior called cratering, shared with bison and some reindeer, and in doing so converted otherwise inaccessible winter vegetation into the high-quality protein and fat that humans need to maintain body heat and function in extreme cold. Horse meat in Saka cuisine is prepared in ways that reflect both the demands of preservation and the genuine pleasures of a rich culinary tradition. Frozen raw horse meat, sliced thin and eaten with salt and seasoning, is a dish called stroganina. Though the term is more often applied to frozen raw fish in the strictest sense, the principle extends to meat as well. Stroganina is, to anyone encountering it for the first time, a somewhat confronting culinary experience. Paper-thin slices of frozen flesh, eaten before they have a chance to thaw, with a clean, cold flavor and a texture that genuinely has no obvious Western analog. To anyone who grew up eating it, it is comfort food of the deepest order. It is also, nutritionally speaking, extraordinary. Raw frozen fish and meat retain vitamins, particularly vitamin C, that cooking destroys, a fact that is not incidental given that traditional Yakutian diets include very few plant sources of vitamin C, and scurvy would be a very real risk in a fully cooked food diet. The vitamin C situation in Yakutia is one of those details that illuminates an entire nutritional logic. In warmer climates, humans get vitamin C primarily from fresh fruits and vegetables. In Yakutia, where fresh produce is unavailable for most of the year and even dried or preserved plant foods have limited vitamin C content, the traditional diet's reliance on raw and lightly processed animal foods, raw frozen fish, blood, fresh organ meats, fermented products, is not cultural preference. It is biochemical necessity. The Saka were getting their vitamin C from sources that European explorers, dying of scurvy on their carefully cooked shipboard rations, never thought to consider. The liver of a freshly caught fish, the blood of a slaughtered animal consumed fresh, the fermented stomach contents of a reindeer, which contain partially digested plant matter with preserved vitamin content. It is, by the standards of European nutritional theory as it existed for most of recorded history, an entirely wrong way to eat. It is also the reason the Saka stayed healthy through winters that would have killed a population eating a more conventionally European diet. There is a quirky footnote to this nutritional story that researchers in the history of Arctic exploration find endlessly instructive. The failure of European expeditions in the Arctic and subarctic was frequently, at its root, a failure to eat like the people who actually lived there. Franklin's lost expedition, countless fur trade era deaths from scurvy and starvation in the Canadian and Siberian North. The pattern repeats with depressing consistency. European explorers arrived with their salted beef and hardtack and their deep cultural reluctance to eat raw animal products, and they died, sometimes within sight of indigenous communities that were eating perfectly well on the very resources the explorers considered primitive or inedible. The lesson, which took an embarrassingly long time to make its way into the institutional knowledge of Western exploration, is simple enough to state and apparently very difficult to actually internalize. When you are operating in someone else's environment, eat their food. The fish of Yakutia deserve their own extended appreciation, because they are central to the food culture in a way that matches the horse in importance. The great rivers of the Saka Republic, the Lena, the Aldan, the Vilyui, the Indijurka, the Kalima, are among the most productive cold-water fish habitats on Earth. Species like the Siberian sturgeon, the Nelma, the Omel, the Muksun, and the Chur have been feeding the people of this region for as long as people have been here, and they are fished with a sophistication and an intimacy that reflects the same depth of knowledge as every other aspect of Saka relationship with their environment. Winter fishing through the ice is a practice that requires knowledge accumulated over many generations and is not easily summarized. The fisherman needs to know where the fish congregate under the ice, which varies by species, by time of year, by river morphology, by water temperature, by a dozen variables that only become second nature through years of practice and careful attention. The tools are simple but precisely adapted. Augers to cut through ice that can be a meter or more thick, nets threaded under the ice through a series of holes, the particular Yakutian ice fishing spear for smaller scale work. In the deepest cold, the fish themselves provide a kind of cooperation. Slowed by the near-freezing water, they cluster in predictable locations, their metabolism reduced to a minimum, waiting for the spring thaw with the patience of creatures that have done this many times before. The fisherman and the fish are, in a sense, both practicing the same art, strategic stillness in the face of conditions that demand adaptation rather than resistance. The preparation and preservation of fish in Yakutia generated a culinary tradition of genuine diversity and, to the unfamiliar nose, considerable olfactory boldness. Yakola, dried fish, prepared by splitting the catch and hanging it to dry in the cold air, is one of the fundamental preserved foods, requiring no heat, no salt, and no technology beyond a sharp knife and a suitable hanging frame. The dry cold of the Yakutian air does the work, drawing moisture from the fish while the sub-zero temperatures prevent bacterial spoilage during the drying process. The result is a dense, intensely flavored product that stores indefinitely in cold conditions and provides concentrated protein and fat with minimal weight and volume. Ideal trail food, ideal emergency food, ideal food for a culture that frequently needs to travel long distances across difficult terrain in extreme conditions. Then there is the fermented fish, the products whose preparation involves controlled decomposition, whose flavors are complex and extreme in ways that require cultural context to appreciate, and whose production the Saka understand as a sophisticated craft rather than a failure of refrigeration. The technical details of fermentation at sub-zero temperatures are genuinely interesting. Certain bacterial and enzymatic processes continue even at low temperatures, producing flavor compounds and texture changes that are different in character from those produced by warmer climate fermentation but equally intentional and equally valued. The sake fermented fish products that might curdle the stomach of a visitor are comfort food to the people who grew up eating them, which is not merely a matter of cultural conditioning but of a palate trained to recognize and appreciate a complex flavor vocabulary that has no direct translation into other culinary traditions. The horse, the cattle, the fish, the game animals, the wild plants gathered in summer, cloudberries, wild onions, various roots and tubers that know how to pack a summer's worth of nutrition into a brief growing season. All of these came together in a food system that was not simply adequate for survival but genuinely rich in its own terms. The sake cuisine that developed from these materials is not a poverty cuisine. It is a cold-weather cuisine of the first order, developed with the same kind of accumulated intelligence and creative refinement that produced any of the world's great regional food traditions, with the additional constraint, and therefore the additional ingenuity, of operating in conditions that leave absolutely no room for waste or error. One of the great traditional sake foods, one that occupies roughly the same emotional and cultural space that bread occupies in a French village or rice in a Japanese household, is salamat, a simple dish of sour cream heated slowly with flour until it thickens into a rich, slightly tangy porridge. Salamat is made from the fermented dairy products of the Yakutian cattle, the rich, high-fat milk that the cold-adapted cows produce, and it represents one of the most direct translations of the landscape's gifts into human nourishment that you can find anywhere. The cow eats the grass of the alas. The cow's body, adapted over centuries to cold, converts that grass into milk of extraordinary richness. The milk, fermented by traditional cultures maintained across generations like a living heirloom, becomes sour cream. The sour cream, heated and thickened, becomes salamat. At every step, the logic of cold weather survival, high fat content, fermentation for preservation, slow cooking that conserves fuel, is built in. The food and the environment and the culture are inseparable. They are the same thing expressed in different registers. The communal dimension of sake food culture is perhaps as important as the technical one. Food in extreme cold societies is rarely a solitary activity, because the logistics of food production in those environments require collective effort. A large animal, a horse slaughtered for winter provisions, provides more meat than a single family can consume before it begins to deteriorate even in cold storage, and the traditional response to this is distribution. Sharing through established community networks that ensure no household goes without while also reinforcing the social bonds that are, themselves, a form of survival infrastructure. A community of people who reliably share resources is a community that will survive a hard winter. A collection of isolated households, each hoarding its own stores, is considerably more fragile. The great communal feast, the celebration around a slaughter, around a successful hunt, around the summer solstice festival of Yakutia, which is the most important event in the sake cultural calendar, is not an indulgence separate from the serious business of survival. It is the serious business of survival, conducted at the level of community cohesion and social obligation rather than individual caloric intake. You eat together, you survive together. The two activities are the same activity. Yakutia, which we should at least meet properly even if we'll encounter it again later, is a summer festival of extraordinary cultural richness, a celebration of the return of warmth, of the renewal of life, of the relationship between the sake people and the world that sustains them. Fermented mare's milk, kumis, the ancient drink of the Turkic and Mongolian steppe peoples, carried north by the ancestral sake and maintained in Yakutia with the same devotion as any sacred tradition, is central to the festival. Kumis is mildly alcoholic, produced by the fermentation of mare's milk by specific bacterial cultures that the sake have maintained for centuries, and its consumption at Yakutia is simultaneously a pleasure, a ritual, and a direct symbolic connection to the ancestors who brought the tradition north from the southern steppe. Every cup of kumis at Yakutia is, in a sense, a small act of cultural memory, a way of tasting the journey that made the sake who they are. The frozen world outside doesn't care about any of this, of course. The permafrost does not have opinions about kumis or salamat or the proper way to hang yakola for drying. The cold is the cold, indifferent and absolute. But the food, the extraordinary, ingenious, culturally dense food system that the sake built in conversation with their impossible landscape, is the warmest possible answer to that indifference. It is the human insistence on not just surviving but savoring, on finding in the gifts of a brutal environment not merely fuel but flavor, not merely sustenance but celebration. Outside your imaginary window, something is cooking on a small stove. The smell is rich and animal and deeply warming, fat rendering, something root vegetable earthy in the background, the sharp fermented note of a dairy product involved at some stage of the process. It is the smell of a kitchen that knows what it's doing. The smell of a food tradition that has been tested by the hardest possible conditions and come out not just intact but genuinely, defiantly delicious. Your stomach, warm and full in your comfortable real-world bed, agrees. Clothing, in most of the world, is a negotiation between practicality and vanity wins more often than we'd like to admit. You choose the jacket that looks good. You sacrifice warmth for silhouette. You wear the shoes that hurt because they're beautiful, and you accept this bargain with the cheerful irrationality of a species that has never quite decided whether it's primarily a survival machine or a performance artist. In Yakutia, this negotiation does not exist. In Yakutia, clothing is armor. It is engineering. It is the difference between walking home and being found in spring, and the Saka approached the problem of dressing for their environment with the same accumulated, iterative, multigenerational intelligence that they brought to their food, their buildings, and their relationship with their livestock. The result is a clothing tradition of such functional sophistication that modern materials scientists, studying traditional Saka garments in museum collections, have found themselves genuinely humbled by what people with needles made from bone and thread made from sinew were able to achieve. The foundational principle of cold weather clothing, the principle that underlies every successful Arctic and subarctic garment tradition from the Inuit of northern Canada to the Nenets of the Yamal Peninsula to the Saka of the Lena Basin, is layering. Not layering in the casual sense that outdoor clothing brands use in their marketing materials, where it means wearing a fleece over a moisture-wicking base layer and feeling virtuous about it. Layering in the genuine, life-critical sense. The deliberate construction of a microclimate around the human body, using multiple distinct layers of material with different thermal properties, creating a system that can be adjusted dynamically as activity levels and ambient temperatures change, trapping dead air, the actual insulator in any cold weather system, not the material itself but the air the material holds still, in quantities and configurations precisely calibrated to keep core body temperature within the narrow band that human biology requires. The Saka layering system, at its most complete for the most extreme conditions, involved garments that worked from the skin outward in a sequence of escalating thermal protection. The innermost layer, worn directly against the skin, was traditionally made from the hide of young animals, deer fawn in particular, or the softest portions of older hides, worked to a suppleness that required hours of manual processing. Tanning and softening animal hide is skilled physical labor, and the Saka women who performed it, hideworking was traditionally women's craft, a gendered division of labor that reflected both the physical demands of the work and the social organization of pastoral households, developed hand and arm strength and specialized knowledge that represented a genuine technical mastery. The inner garment needed to be soft enough not to abrade skin during long periods of wear, permeable enough to allow moisture, sweat, the deadly enemy of cold weather insulation, to move outward rather than accumulate next to the body, and warm enough to provide meaningful insulation in its own right. Over this went the main outer garment, the Saka fur coat, called a doha in its most elaborate form, which is the kind of garment that, when you see photographs of it in ethnographic collections, produces the immediate and involuntary thought that this is what a coat should look like. The doha is long, reaching to the calves or ankles. It is made from reindeer, horse, or bear fur. The choice of material depending on availability, the severity of the conditions, and the social status of the wearer, with bear fur representing the apex of warmth and prestige. The fur is worn with the hair side outward for moderate conditions and, in extreme cold, sometimes reversed so the fur is against the body, doubling the insulating layer. The cut is generous enough to allow freedom of movement. The Saka needed to be able to mount and ride horses, to work with livestock, to perform the physical tasks of outdoor life at extreme temperatures, while being close enough at the critical points of heat loss, the neck, wrists, and hem, to prevent the chimney effect that undermines any coat's performance when cold air can circulate inside it. The collar of the doha is a structural and thermal masterpiece in miniature. Traditional Saka fur collars are deep, often framing the entire lower face when raised, and made from the particular furs, wolverine and wolf being the most prized. that have a specific property no other natural or synthetic material has yet fully replicated. The guard hairs of wolverine and wolf fur have a surface structure that prevents the condensation of breath moisture from freezing onto them. Every other fur, when used as a face-framing collar in extreme cold, accumulates a rim of ice from the wearer's breath within a few hours of outdoor exposure. Wolverine and wolf fur don't. The ice crystals simply don't adhere to the hair structure in the same way. This is not mysticism or cultural preference. It is material science, discovered empirically through generations of use and encoded into cultural knowledge as a firm preference for specific materials that, to the uninformed observer, might look like arbitrary status-seeking but is actually hard-won functional wisdom. Modern synthetic materials designers have been studying this property of wolverine fur for decades and have not produced a fully satisfactory artificial analog. The wolverine remains ahead of the laboratory on this particular problem, which the wolverine, being a wolverine, probably finds entirely unsurprising. The footwear situation in Yakutia deserves particular attention because the feet, those furthest extremities, first to lose circulation, most exposed to conducted cold from the ground, are where cold-weather clothing systems most often fail and where the consequences of failure are most immediately apparent. The Saka developed a boot tradition of extraordinary sophistication, and the central garment of that tradition, the torbesa, a traditional Saka boot made from the leg skin of reindeer or horse, demonstrates several principles of thermal engineering simultaneously. The leg skin of ungulates has a particular hair density and follicle orientation that makes it an exceptionally efficient insulator in boot form. The hair grows in a direction that naturally sheds snow rather than accumulating it. The skin itself, processed using traditional methods that preserve its natural oils and flexibility, remains supple at temperatures that would make conventional tanned leather rigid and unwearable. Inside the torbesa go multiple layers of insulation and moisture management, dried grasses, felt insoles, inner socks made from fawn skin worn hair inward, creating a system that keeps the foot warm through several mechanisms simultaneously. Insulation from ambient cold, moisture wicking from perspiration, and a cushioning layer that reduces conducted cold from ground contact. The torbesa are also deliberately made slightly large, because tight footwear restricts circulation, and restricted circulation in a cold environment accelerates heat loss from the extremities with brutal efficiency. This is a detail that took Western polar explorers an embarrassingly long time to learn. The instinct to lace boots tight for stability is exactly wrong in serious cold, and it cost toes and sometimes lives before the lesson was widely absorbed. The mittens of the Saka tradition follow similar principles, large enough for the fingers to be held together within the mitten, maximizing the heat sharing between digits rather than insulating each finger individually as a glove does, with a cuff long enough to overlap the coat sleeve and eliminate the gap at the wrist that cold exploits with the gleeful efficiency of a draft through a keyhole. Traditional Saka mittens were often made in a double layer, with an inner mitten of soft skin and an outer shell of heavier fur, the two layers trapping an airspace between them that contributed meaningfully to the overall thermal performance. They were attached to the coat sleeve or to a cord running through the coat, ensuring that a dropped mitten, the kind of small accident that in ordinary circumstances produces nothing more than mild annoyance, could never become, in a -50 wind, the beginning of a medical emergency. The headgear of Yakutia is, visually, the most immediately striking element of the traditional clothing system, and it is striking for very good functional reasons. The human head, which contains the brain and its enormous metabolic demands, is responsible for a disproportionate share of total body heat loss. Estimates vary, but the head can account for a significant fraction of total heat dissipation in cold conditions, particularly when the rest of the body is well insulated. Traditional Saka winter hats are accordingly substantial. Large, fur-lined, covering the ears completely, often with a deep brim that can be pulled down over the forehead and face, and made from the warmest available materials. The most elaborate traditional headdresses, worn for ceremonial occasions and as markers of social status, combined practical thermal function with aesthetic complexity, beadwork, embroidery, symbolic motifs worked in thread or metal, in a way that reflects the Saka understanding that the line between functional object and beautiful object was not a line worth drawing. There is a quirky detail in the anthropological literature on Saka clothing that illuminates the depth of thought invested in this material culture. The traditional Saka clothing system was designed to be repaired in the field, with hand tools, from materials that could be sourced from the environment. The sinew thread that stitched the garments was also carried as emergency repair kit. The bone needles were robust enough to work through frozen hide if necessary. A Sokka traveler caught by a deteriorating situation, unexpected temperature drop, gear failure, the need to shelter unexpectedly, had, in their clothing itself, the resources to make emergency repairs or improvise additional insulation from available materials. The clothing system was not just passive protection. It was an active toolkit for managing cold weather emergencies. The gendered dimension of this material culture is worth dwelling on briefly without overly dramatizing it, because it reflects something important about how Sokka society distributed the cognitive load of survival. The production of cold weather clothing, the tanning, the cutting, the stitching, the fitting, the ongoing maintenance and repair, was women's work in the traditional Sokka division of labor, and it was not incidental or subordinate work. It was essential, technically demanding, and socially recognized as such. A woman's skill in hide working and sewing was a central component of her social reputation, her marriageability, her standing within her community. The ability to produce garments that kept your family alive was not background domestic labor. It was a life-critical technical skill practiced by specialists whose expertise was as respected, within the community's own value framework, as the hunting or herding skills of the men who depended on their products. This is not to romanticize the division of labor or suggest that it was experienced as perfectly equitable by everyone involved. Human social arrangements rarely are. But historians still argue whether the status of women in traditional Sokka society was genuinely higher than in neighboring or contemporary cultures, or whether the evident respect for women's technical skills existed within a broader structure of social constraint that qualified its significance. And that argument, which touches on questions of how to measure status and freedom across cultural contexts, remains genuinely unresolved. What is clear is that the cold weather clothing tradition of Yakutia was built on expertise held primarily by women, and that expertise represented a form of power over the survival of families, households, and communities that no serious examination of Yakushan history can afford to overlook. Modern materials science has, as mentioned, studied traditional Sokka garments with considerable interest, and the findings are consistently respectful and occasionally humbling. A study of traditional reindeer skin garments from Siberian indigenous traditions found thermal resistance values comparable to or exceeding modern high-performance synthetic insulation systems, and this without the benefit of 2 centuries of industrial chemistry, materials engineering, computer modeling, or any of the other tools that the modern outdoor clothing industry deploys in the pursuit of warmth. The traditional materials achieve their performance through the accumulated wisdom of selection, always choosing the right part of the right animal at the right season, always processing it in the right way, rather than through the engineering of fundamentally new materials. It is an optimization of the natural world rather than a replacement of it, and in many respects it is more impressive precisely because it works within constraints rather than attempting to circumvent them. The question of what happens when you get wet in a Yakushan winter is one that traditional clothing systems address differently from modern ones, and the difference is instructive. Modern cold weather clothing places enormous emphasis on moisture-wicking synthetic base layers and waterproof breathable outer shells, the Gore-Tex paradigm, in which technological membranes attempt to manage the fundamental incompatibility between breathability and waterproofness. Traditional Sokka clothing addresses the wet problem primarily by not getting wet in the first place, through behavioral rules, through the management of sweat through pacing and layering adjustments, through the selection of outer materials that shed surface moisture without absorbing it, and through the cultural knowledge that being wet in serious cold is a situation to prevent rather than manage after the fact. The traditional approach encodes a philosophical difference. Rather than engineering a material that can handle wetness, engineer a set of behaviors that avoid it. Prevention rather than cure in material form. There is a broader lesson somewhere in this. One that seems worth carrying quietly into the warmth of the night that is gradually settling around you. The Sokka clothing tradition is, at its heart, a system built on the principle of working with physical reality rather than against it. Not trying to beat the cold with the right jacket, but understanding the cold so thoroughly, its mechanisms, its entry points, its relationship to human physiology, that you can navigate it rather than merely resist it. It is the difference between fighting a river and learning to swim. The cold outside does not change. It is what it is, -50, -60, whatever the morning will bring. What changes, what has always been the only thing capable of changing in this relationship between human and environment, is the human. The knowledge in their hands, the skill in their stitching, the understanding worn close to the body like the warmest of all possible layers, of exactly what they are up against and exactly what they need to meet it. Somewhere in Yakutia right now, in the real Yakutia, the one turning quietly in the dark on the other side of the planet from wherever you are resting, someone is checking that their outdoor gear is in order before tomorrow. Running a finger along a seam, making sure the hood closure is intact. The temperature will be what it will be, and they will be dressed for it, as their grandparents were and their grandparents before them, in the long, warm, unbroken line of people who learned, stitch by careful stitch, how to carry their own climate with them into the cold. The Russians came to Yakutia in the early 17th century with fur on their minds and empire in their organizational DNA, and they changed everything, slowly at first, then with the particular acceleration that colonial administrative machinery generates once it finds its footing. The first Cossack expeditions into the Lena Basin arrived in the 1620s, and by 1632 a winter quarters had been established at a location on the Lena River that would eventually become Yakutsk, today the largest city in the world built on continuous permafrost, a distinction that carries a certain geological drama that the city's founders, focused primarily on collecting fur taxes and not freezing to death, probably did not pause to appreciate. The Yasak system we touched on earlier, the fur tribute extracted from indigenous Siberian peoples, was the engine of Russian eastward expansion across Siberia, and it operated with a ruthless efficiency that the Tsarist state had refined through practice on the peoples of the Urals and western Siberia before bringing it east. The Saka, numerous and organized enough to resist in some instances and negotiate in others, were brought into the system over several decades of a process that combined military pressure, diplomatic maneuvering, and the gradual installation of Russian administrative structures that reorganized Saka social life around Russian fiscal needs. The fur trade era transformed Yakutia's relationship with the outside world without, and this is the crucial thing, fundamentally transforming the Saka themselves. Russian traders brought metal tools, which the Saka adopted with enthusiasm because metal tools are, objectively, better than bone and stone tools, and no cultural pride is worth a dull knife in a -40 situation. They brought new trade goods, new diseases. Smallpox moved through Yakutia's indigenous population with devastating efficiency, as it moved through every indigenous population it encountered in the colonial era, and the demographic consequences were severe, and new administrative categories that slowly restructured the Saka clan system into something the Russian bureaucracy could tax and record. But the Saka language remained the Saka language. The Elanco continued to be sung. The horses continued to paw through the snow for their food. The permafrost continued to preserve everything that fell into it, indifferent to who claimed sovereignty over the surface above. The real transformation, the transformation that went deeper than trade goods and tax records, that reached into the actual structure of Yakutian life and attempted to remake it according to an ideological blueprint drawn up thousands of miles away by people who had never spent a winter in the Lena Basin, came much later. It came in 1917 with the revolution, and it arrived in Yakutia with the force of a geological event and roughly the same degree of prior consultation with the local population. The Bolsheviks who extended Soviet power into Siberia in the early 1920s brought with them a complete theory of how human society should be organized, and that theory had been developed in the context of industrial European Russia and had approximately nothing to say about the specific realities of life in one of the most extreme environments on Earth. This did not slow them down. Soviet ideological confidence in the universal applicability of its organizational principles was one of its most defining characteristics, and, in the cold light of history, one of its most consequential flaws. The collectivization of Yakutian agriculture and animal husbandry, the forced reorganization of traditional pastoral households into collective farms, kolkhozy, operating under centralized state direction, was applied to Yakutia with the same template used in the Ukrainian grain belt and the Kazakh steppe, with predictably different results because Yakutia is not Ukraine and horses are not wheat and the permafrost does not respond to 5-year plans. The collectivization of Yakutian livestock in the late 1920s and 1930s was, by any honest accounting, a catastrophe. Traditional Saka animal husbandry worked because it was managed by people with deep, accumulated, locally specific knowledge of which pastures were best at which season, of how to read the winter weather, of the particular needs and behaviors of Yakutian breeds that had been developed over centuries precisely for these conditions. Collectivization replaced this distributed, expert, locally calibrated management with centralized direction from administrators who frequently lacked both the local knowledge and the practical experience to make good decisions about animals whose survival requirements were as exacting as those of the people who kept them. The results were predictable to anyone outside the ideological framework and apparently invisible to anyone within it. Livestock numbers collapsed. The traditional Yakutian cattle and horse breeds, the cold-adapted, centuries-developed breeds that were the only domestic animals capable of surviving Yakutian conditions without intensive human support, were partially replaced by higher-yield imported breeds that produced more milk or meat under ideal conditions and died under Yakutian ones. The permafrost storage pits, the traditional food preservation system of extraordinary effectiveness, were disfavored in collectivized agriculture in favor of centralized storage facilities that were, in many cases, less effective and more expensive to operate. It is one of history's more bitter ironies that a political system committed to improving material conditions for working people managed, in Yakutia, to systematically destroy a material culture that had been successfully sustaining working people through one of the world's most challenging environments for centuries. Historians still argue whether the damage done to traditional Yakutian agriculture and food systems during collectivization was the result of deliberate cultural suppression, ideological blindness to local conditions, administrative incompetence, or some compound of all three. And the argument is complicated by the fact that Soviet-era records from Yakutia are not always complete or reliable, having been produced by an administrative system with strong incentives to report success rather than failure. But collectivization was only one dimension of the Soviet transformation of Yakutia. The other, larger, more physically dramatic transformation was the Gulag. The Soviet forced labor camp system, the Gulag, an acronym for the Russian phrase meaning Chief Administration of Corrective Labor Camps, reached into Yakutia with particular intensity from the 1930s onward, establishing a network of camps across the territory that at its peak held hundreds of thousands of prisoners engaged in mining, construction, and other forms of resource extraction in conditions of extreme hardship. The geography of Yakutia, which had always been its own kind of prison, escape into the surrounding landscape in winter was essentially impossible without the specialized equipment and knowledge that prisoners did not have, made it ideal for the Gulag system's logic. The cold was a wall. The distance was a wall. The permafrost was a wall. You didn't need to build as many fences when the environment itself provided containment. The camps of the Kolyma region, technically administered as part of Magadan Oblast rather than the Yakutsk ASSR, but geographically and climatically continuous with Yakutia, became the most notorious in the entire Gulag system, synonymous in Russian cultural memory with cold, starvation, brutal labor, and death on a scale that still resists easy comprehension. Kolyma gold, extracted from the permafrost by prisoner labor under conditions that combined extreme cold with extreme deprivation, funded significant portions of Soviet industrial development. The human cost was, by various estimates, hundreds of thousands of lives, though the exact figures remain contested because Soviet record-keeping on prisoner mortality was not designed for external audit. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, himself a Gulag survivor though not of Kolyma specifically, called Kolyma the pole of cold and cruelty, a phrase that carries more weight for having come from someone who had direct experience of the comparison class. The infrastructure that the Soviet period built in Yakutia, roads, airports, industrial facilities, cities, was in significant part built by Gulag labor, and the moral weight of that founding is not something that modern Yakutia has fully resolved, any more than any society has fully resolved the moral weight of foundational violence in its built environment. Yakutsk itself, which grew dramatically during the Soviet period from a regional trading post into a genuine city, sits on permafrost that its Soviet-era buildings were, in many cases, poorly designed to accommodate, producing the distinctive Yakutsk phenomenon of tilting, sinking, frost-heaved structures that give parts of the city a slightly surrealist quality, as though the ground beneath has been quietly registering its objection to the whole arrangement. Building on permafrost is, it turns out, a problem of genuine engineering subtlety that the Soviet period addressed with varying degrees of success. The fundamental challenge is counterintuitive. The danger is not that your building will freeze into the permafrost, but that it will thaw it. A heated building sitting on frozen ground transfers warmth downward through its foundation, melting the ice in the permafrost beneath, which then loses its structural strength. Ice is rigid and strong, but liquid water or saturated soil is not, causing the building to settle, sink, and eventually fail. The traditional Saka Balagan avoided this problem through its modest heat output and earthen construction. Soviet-era concrete apartment buildings, pumping far more heat into the ground, needed engineered solutions. The solution eventually adopted for serious permafrost construction, And this is one of the genuine engineering achievements of the Soviet period in Siberia, credit where it's due, was to elevate the building on piles driven deep into the permafrost, leaving a ventilated air gap between the building's floor and the ground surface. Cold air circulating through this gap prevents the building's heat from penetrating the ground, maintaining the permafrost in its frozen, load-bearing state. Walking through central Yakutsk today, you see this principle everywhere. Buildings raised on columns with open space beneath them, looking slightly as though they are practicing for levitation. It is an elegant engineering solution to a problem that the traditional Saka building culture avoided by not generating enough heat to create it in the first place, which is either a demonstration of the power of modern engineering or a somewhat roundabout way of arriving at a problem that local knowledge had preemptively solved. The Soviet period also brought mass education to Yakutia, schools, literacy campaigns, and eventually universities, in ways that, whatever their ideological content, produced genuine and lasting changes in Saka cultural life. The Saka language, previously unwritten, was given a writing system, first in Latin script in the late 1920s, then switched to Cyrillic in 1939, a change that was partly administrative convenience and partly a deliberate strategy to reduce the legibility of the Saka written tradition to anyone who might read the earlier Latin script materials. A Saka literary tradition emerged, producing poets and novelists and playwrights who worked in the Saka language within the constraints of Soviet cultural policy, which were real and sometimes suffocating, but which the best Saka writers navigated with the same creative resourcefulness that their ancestors had applied to the cold. You work with what you have. You find the warmth within the constraint. The industrial development of Yakutia's mineral wealth, diamonds, gold, coal, natural gas, accelerated through the Soviet period and transformed the economic and demographic geography of the territory. The discovery of the Mirny diamond pipe in 1955 led to the establishment of one of the most remarkable industrial sites in the world. The Mirny open-pit diamond mine, which at its operational peak was the largest open-pit mine on Earth, so vast that it generated its own downward air current strong enough to be hazardous to helicopters. Mirny, the city that grew up around the mine, is a Soviet industrial settlement of the standard type, utilitarian, dense, oriented entirely around the extraction operation. Sitting in the middle of the Yakutian taiga with the slightly improbable quality of all Soviet-era Siberian cities, as though someone has picked up a piece of Moscow's industrial suburbs and put it down somewhere geographically inappropriate without particularly worrying about context. The diamond wealth of Yakutia, and Yakutia produces a significant fraction of the world's rough diamonds, primarily through the operations of the company Alrosa, which is majority state-owned and operates multiple mines across the Sakha Republic, has made the territory economically significant to the Russian federal state in ways that create their own complicated politics. The revenues from diamond and gold extraction flow primarily to Moscow rather than remaining in Yakutia, a fiscal arrangement that generates ongoing tension between the Sakha Republic's government and the federal center, and that sits uncomfortably alongside the poverty and inadequate infrastructure that characterizes many rural communities in the territory. The diamonds come out of Yakutian ground, worked by Yakutian labor in Yakutian cold, and the wealth they generate is largely not Yakutian, which is a story familiar to most resource-rich territories that exist within larger state structures, but no less worth stating for its familiarity. There is a detail about the Soviet period in Yakutia that sits in the fringe literature of Cold War history and has never quite made it into the mainstream narrative. Soviet scientists stationed in Yakutia during the Cold War conducted extensive research into the psychological effects of extreme cold and darkness on human cognitive function and morale, research that had obvious military applications in the context of potential Arctic conflict with NATO forces. Some of this research fed into the design of Soviet military cold weather equipment and training protocols. Some of it apparently informed the design of living conditions in certain gulag camps, which is the kind of detail that lands in the stomach rather than the intellect. The full extent of this research program remains partially classified, and historians working on Soviet cold weather science find their access to archival materials from this period frustratingly incomplete. The Soviet experiment in Yakutia was, in the end, what most grand experiments are when conducted by ideologically certain administrators on people and landscapes they don't fully understand. Partially successful, frequently damaging, occasionally inspired, and ultimately unable to achieve its most ambitious goals. The permafrost did not conform to the 5-year plan. The Sakha language did not disappear as Soviet nationalities policy at various points seemed to intend. The traditional knowledge did not evaporate under the pressure of socialist modernity. And when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, and the administrative structures that had reorganized Yakutian life for 7 decades suddenly lost their authority and their funding simultaneously. What emerged from beneath them was not a blank slate but a Saka culture that had been waiting, with the patience of the permafrost, for the weight above it to shift. The cold, through all of it, through the Cossacks and the Yasak and the collectivization and the Gulag and the diamond mines and the tilting apartment buildings, remained exactly what it had always been. Patient, absolute, unimpressed by human organizational schemes of any ideological flavor. -50 is -50 whether you are a Saka elder, a Tsarist fur trader, a Soviet mining engineer, or a post-Soviet diamond company executive. The cold makes no distinctions. It never has. It is, in this respect, the most democratic force in Yakutia, the great equalizer that every human inhabitant of this territory, regardless of their status or their politics or their relationship to power, must negotiate on exactly the same terms. Outside, the wind has come up slightly, unusual in the deep cold, which tends towards stillness but not unheard of. It moves through the birch forest at the edge of the Alas with a sound like distant conversation, low and continuous. A light in a window somewhere holds steady against the dark. The permafrost beneath it all holds steady too, as it has held for 2 million years, remembering everything and surrendering nothing. Not yet, anyway. There is a town at the end of the world, and its name is Oymyakon. You've probably heard of it, or seen it surface briefly in your social media feed between a recipe video and someone's cat doing something inadvisable. One of those geographic curiosities that the internet discovers periodically and circulates with the breathless energy of someone who has just learned that cold places exist. But the viral headlines, "World's Coldest Town," with a photograph of a thermometer reading that makes your eyes water, capture almost nothing of what Oymyakon actually is, which is a place of such specific, peculiar, quietly extraordinary human habitation that it deserves something considerably more than a caption. It deserves, at minimum, a long, slow, careful look. The kind of look that you can only really give something when you're warm and horizontal and have nowhere to be until morning. Oymyakon sits in the Oymyakon Valley of the Saka Republic, cradled between mountain ranges that do for cold air exactly what a bowl does for soup. They hold it in, concentrate it, prevent it from dispersing into the broader atmosphere. The valley is a natural cold trap, and the physics of this arrangement are simple and remorseless. Cold air is denser than warm air, so it sinks. The surrounding mountains prevent the cold air that accumulates in the valley from flowing away. It pools, deepens, and intensifies with the patient efficiency of something that has been doing this for a very long time. The result is a microclimate of such extreme cold that even by Yakutian standards, which are themselves already at the far end of the global distribution of temperatures experienced by permanent human settlements, Oymyakon stands apart. It is cold in the way that certain things are not merely examples of a category but definitions of it. The record temperature associated with Oymyakon, -67.7 Celsius, recorded in 1933, though some sources cite the figure as -71.2, was measured during the Stalin era by a Soviet meteorologist named Sergei Oberchev, who was conducting a geographical expedition through the region and whose temperature readings were later the subject of the kind of measurement accuracy debate that arises whenever historical extreme data is examined by modern standards. Historians still argue whether the 1933 Oymyakon reading or the 1892 Verkhoyansk reading of -67.8 represents the true record low for a permanently inhabited location. The competition is friendly only in the sense that both towns seem to have accepted their respective claims to the title with a mixture of local pride and weary bemusement, the way you might feel about being famous for something you didn't exactly choose. Either way, the competition for coldest inhabited place on Earth is a two-horse race in which both horses are already implausibly cold, and the margin between them is the kind of thing that only matters to meteorologists and the editors of record books. What matters more, what is actually interesting, in the way that human beings rather than thermometers are interesting, is what daily life in Oymyakon looks like. And the answer, which surprises almost everyone who encounters it for the first time, is surprisingly normal. Dismayingly, almost comically normal. There are people here who wake up in the morning and make breakfast and argue with their children about whether they've done their homework and wonder whether they need to stop at the shop on the way home. They have opinions about politics and preferences in music and complicated feelings about their in-laws. The cold is not the defining texture of their inner lives. It is the defining texture of their outer logistics, which is a different thing entirely, and the distinction is worth sitting with. The logistics, however, are genuinely something. Let's walk through a winter morning in Oymyakon with the kind of detail that the situation deserves. Because the details are where the real story lives. You wake before dawn, which in midwinter means waking well before 8 or 9 in the morning. Since Oymyakon at this latitude receives only 3 or 4 hours of functional daylight in December and January, a pale, low, briefly luminous twilight rather than anything you'd confidently call day. The temperature outside is, let's say, -55. This is not an extreme day by Oymyakon standards. This is a Tuesday. School is still on. Work is still expected. Life is still happening. The first thing you do not do is what you would do in a warmer climate. You do not simply open the door and step outside. The transition from heated interior to exterior air at -55 requires a moment of deliberate preparation that becomes so habitual as to be unconscious but is never casual. Every item of outdoor clothing goes on before the door opens. Not mostly on, not almost on, but completely on, every layer in the correct order, every fastening secured. The door itself is a thermal engineering project. Oymyakon homes typically have a porch or vestibule, an intermediate space between the heated interior and the exterior that functions as a thermal airlock, preventing the catastrophic heat loss that would occur if the heated living space were opened directly to the outside air. You dress in the vestibule. You close the inner door before opening the outer one. This is not fussiness. This is how you keep your house warm without running your heating system at full capacity continuously, which would consume fuel at a rate that is either financially ruinous or simply unavailable. Outside, several immediate realities assert themselves. Your breath crackles and falls. The whisper of the stars that we mentioned at the very beginning of tonight's journey. Remember that? In tiny ice crystals that catch what little ambient light there is. Your nostrils, if unprotected, freeze together slightly with each breath. This is not painful exactly. The cold itself numbs the sensation, but it is a persistent and peculiar reminder of exactly what you're dealing with. Any exposed skin, the bridge of your nose, the small triangle between your scarf and your hat, begins reporting in almost immediately with information you'd prefer not to receive. You cover it. You always cover it. The people of Oymyakon do not have a casual relationship with exposed skin in winter. They have the relationship that a person has with a gas burner that they know from long experience will ignite at the slightest provocation. The cars in Oymyakon are, in winter, essentially never turned off. This is not laziness or environmental indifference, though it is, objectively, a significant source of fuel consumption and emissions. It is simply the reality of operating internal combustion engines at -55. Engine oil at these temperatures has the viscosity of something considerably thicker than engine oil is supposed to be, and the friction required to turn a cold engine over from a standing start can exceed what the starter motor can provide. Batteries, whose chemical processes slow dramatically in extreme cold, may not have the capacity to attempt the start in the first place. The standard practice in Oymyakon for a car that must be started from cold involves an external heat source, a flame heater applied to the engine block, which requires time and attention and is one of those morning rituals that adds a solid 15 to 30 minutes to any journey involving a vehicle that has been allowed to cool overnight. Most residents simply don't let the vehicles cool. The engine runs. All day, all night if necessary. The fuel economy is not the priority. Getting the car to start is the priority, and in this calculation, the car wins. There is a quirky detail about Oymyakon's infrastructure that strikes visitors as both logical and slightly surreal. The town has no underground utility pipes. Pipes, for water, for sewage, for heating, cannot be buried in permafrost in the conventional way, because the heat they carry would thaw the ground around them, causing subsidence, and the cold they encounter in winter would freeze any water-carrying pipe that lost its flow for more than a very brief period. Oymyakon's utility infrastructure runs above ground, heavily insulated, in wooden troughs and housings that give the village a slightly improvised quality. A network of wooden boxes and wrapped pipes running along the surface between buildings like a visible nervous system. It is not beautiful in any conventional architectural sense. It is completely honest about its purpose, which is perhaps a form of beauty in itself. The school in Oymyakon, and there is a school with children attending it because education in Russia is compulsory and the cold is not considered a sufficient excuse, operates under a temperature protocol that establishes the threshold at which outdoor activities are suspended. Classes continue in all but the most extreme conditions. the temperature at which school is officially canceled for cold, a threshold that varies slightly by source and has apparently been adjusted over the years, is generally cited at around -52 to -55 Celsius. Below that, children stay home. Above that, meaning temperatures that are merely extremely cold rather than life-threateningly cold, school is on. The children walk there. They play outside at recess briefly in full gear. They are, by the time they are 7 or 8 years old, already more competent at cold weather outdoor management than most adults in temperate climates will ever be. They know, in their bodies, things that would take a survival instructor in a warmer country an entire weekend course to convey. This embodied knowledge, the cold competence that Oymyakon children develop simply by living their lives in the place where they were born, is one of the more quietly remarkable things about the settlement. It is knowledge that cannot be downloaded or briefed or summarized in a listicle. It lives in the muscles and the reflexes and the unconscious monitoring systems of people who have been cold weather humans since before they could articulate what that meant. The recognition of early frostbite symptoms. The intuitive calculation of how long you can stay outside based on temperature, wind, and what you're wearing. The habit of constant, low-level attention to the state of your extremities. The knowledge of when to push on and when to shelter, which is perhaps the most important wilderness survival skill of all, and one that Oymyakon residents acquire not through any formal instruction but through the ordinary accumulation of lived experience in a place that provides very clear feedback. The population of Oymyakon is small. Estimates range from around 500 to just over 1,000 people depending on the time of year and the reliability of the census data, and it is, like most remote rural settlements in Russia, slowly declining as younger people leave for larger towns and cities where employment opportunities are more varied and the cold is somewhat less absolute. This is not unique to Oymyakon. It is the pattern of rural depopulation familiar from Appalachia to the Scottish Highlands to the steppes of Inner Mongolia, the same gravitational pull of urban opportunity drawing young people away from places that shaped them, leaving an older, smaller community maintaining a way of life whose future is uncertain. The tourism that has developed around Oymyakon's reputation as the world's coldest inhabited place is a genuinely interesting phenomenon and a source of real, if modest, economic activity for the community. Visitors, primarily adventure travelers, photographers, journalists, and the category of person who collects extreme geographical experiences the way others collect stamps, come to Oymyakon specifically to experience the cold, which is a curious inversion of the usual logic of travel. People generally go toward warmth. Going deliberately toward -60 requires a specific motivation that the residents of Oymyakon find simultaneously flattering and mildly baffling. The same way a fish might feel about a tourist who had traveled a very long distance specifically to observe the fish being wet. The tourist experience of Oymyakon includes, depending on the operator and the season, demonstrations of the legendary cold weather phenomena that circulate on social media. Boiling water thrown into the air that freezes before it hits the ground. A genuine effect, not camera trickery, though it requires temperatures well below -40 to work reliably, and the boiling water needs to be genuinely boiling rather than merely hot for the surface area to vaporize and freeze quickly enough. Wet clothes hung outside that freeze rigid within minutes. Bananas hammered into the ground as nails. The banana nail is particularly popular with visitors and is, from a material science perspective, entirely legitimate. Fruit at -50 has a hardness comparable to hardwood, and a frozen banana will indeed drive a small nail into softwood before it warms enough to lose structural integrity. This is the kind of demonstration that makes a very immediate point about what temperature does to material properties, and it is more memorable than any number of thermometer photographs. The food available in Oymyakon is, predictably, a version of the traditional sake diet we explored earlier, horse meat and fish forming the protein backbone, dairy products providing fat and energy, the whole system organized around the permafrost storage and cold preservation principles that have sustained life here for centuries. The local foal meat, the meat of young horses, which in Yakutian cuisine is prized for its tenderness and its particular fat profile, is by most accounts genuinely excellent, with a mild, clean flavor that the cold climate seems to contribute to, as it does with most protein sources raised outdoors in Yakutia. The combination of extreme cold, minimal stress, and the particular forage available to free-ranging Yakutian horses produces a meat that food writers who have made the journey to try it tend to describe with the careful enthusiasm of people who expected to be politely tolerant and found themselves genuinely delighted. Oymyakon has a monument, a simple stele erected in the village to commemorate its status as the Pole of Cold, the coldest permanently inhabited place on Earth. It is a modest structure as monuments go, and photographed by essentially every visitor who makes the journey. There is something appropriate about the modesty of it. The place itself is the monument. The people living in it are the monument. The fact that there are children doing homework here tonight, that there is food on stoves, that there are cars running in the dark with their engines turning over in the cold, that is the monument. Stone and metal are fine commemorative materials, but they are considerably less impressive, in the final accounting, than a functioning human community in a location where human community should be impossible. The winter night in Oymyakon is something that travel writers struggle to do justice to, partly because the vocabulary of the sublime has been somewhat worn down by overuse and partly because the actual experience seems to resist language in the way that extreme things often do. The darkness is total and clear. The Milky Way overhead is not a feature of the sky but the sky itself, the background radiation of the galaxy made visible in a way that light-polluted urban eyes have largely forgotten is possible. The aurora borealis, when it comes, moves across the sky with a silence that feels active rather than merely absent. A green and sometimes violet curtain of charged particles interacting with the Earth's magnetic field in a display that every culture that has ever lived under it has found reason to attach spiritual significance to. The Saka saw in the aurora the spirits of their ancestors. Modern physics provides a different explanation that is no less astonishing. Perhaps both accounts are doing the same work, reaching for language adequate to something that exceeds ordinary description. The cold at night in Oymyakon is, paradoxically, often accompanied by a kind of beauty that its severity makes both more striking and more poignant. The ice crystals in the air, the diamond dust, the meteorologists call it, tiny ice crystals suspended in the atmosphere at very low temperatures, catch the moonlight and the starlight and scatter it in halos and arcs and pillars that appear around any light source. Moon pillars, sun dogs, ice halos, the full optical vocabulary of an atmosphere saturated with ice, are common winter phenomena here, producing skies of such visual complexity and strangeness that they seem designed to make the case that the universe has aesthetic ambitions. The cold that creates these phenomena is the same cold that would kill you in minutes without the right gear. Beauty and danger in Yakutia are not opposites. They are the same thing wearing different clothes. And here, in this small settlement at the end of a long road through the taiga, a road that is, for much of the year, a river, the Kolyma Highway, also known as the Road of Bones for reasons that the Soviet labor history we discussed earlier makes grimly clear, people are going to sleep tonight. They have checked their heating systems and their outdoor gear. They have fed their animals if they have animals. They have done the 1,000 small, competent, habitual things that living in Oymyakon requires you to do every day as a matter of basic maintenance. The way people in warmer places check that the door is locked or the coffee maker is off. The cold outside is not their enemy tonight. It is their context, their home, the thing that shaped them and was shaped by them in return, across generations of the most intimate possible relationship between a people and a place. And it is, in its own enormous, indifferent, crystalline way, astonishingly beautiful. The young woman posting on TikTok is wearing traditional Saka beadwork earrings and a Canada Goose jacket, and she is standing outside in -43°C with the particular casual confidence of someone who considers this a perfectly normal filming environment, which she does because it is. Her video, in which she cracks an egg outside and watches it freeze before it hits the ground, narrating in a mixture of Saka and Russian with English subtitles added in post, will get 400,000 views by morning. She lives in Yakutsk. She is 22 years old. She has a university degree in digital media, a cat named Buat, which means beauty in the Saka language, and a grandmother who knows 300 verses of the Elanco by heart. These facts coexist in her without contradiction, because she is a person rather than a symbol, and people contain contradictions the way the permafrost contains mammoths, completely without apology, for as long as necessary. This is modern Yakutia. Not the Yakutia of the ethnographic museum display or the polar exploration documentary or the Soviet Industrial Archive photograph. The Yakutia of right now, tonight, in the real world turning on the other side of the planet. A place of extraordinary complexity where ancient cultural traditions and digital modernity exist not in tension but in conversation, where the permafrost is thawing at the edges while the diamonds are still being extracted from the center, where young people are simultaneously leaving for Moscow and St. Petersburg and coming back, changed, to a place that changed while they were gone. Modern Yakutia is not a simple story. It is a story with multiple plots running simultaneously, some of them contradictory, most of them unresolved, all of them alive. Let's start with the diamonds, because the diamonds are where the money is, and in any honest account of a place, the money is where significant portions of the story live, whether we find that romantic or not. The Sakha Republic sits atop one of the world's most significant diamond deposits, and the extraction of those diamonds, primarily through Alrosa, the Russian state-controlled mining company that dominates the industry, generates revenues that make Yakutia economically important to the Russian federal state in a proportion wildly out of step with its population. Roughly a quarter of the world's rough diamonds come from Yakutian mines. The Jubilee Pipe, the Udakni Pipe, the various Alrosa operations scattered across the Republic's vast territory. These are industrial operations of significant scale, employing tens of thousands of workers and requiring infrastructure, energy, and logistical support systems that have fundamentally shaped the economic and physical geography of the territory. The relationship between this diamond wealth and the well-being of the Sakha Republic's actual population is, as these relationships tend to be in resource extraction economies, complicated. The Sakha Republic government receives a share of diamond revenues, and this share funds public services, infrastructure, and the various programs of cultural preservation and economic development that the Republic's administration pursues with varying degrees of success. But a significant majority of the revenue flows to Moscow and to Alrosa's shareholders, in a fiscal arrangement that local political leaders have at various points described with the careful diplomatic language that politicians use when they mean something considerably more pointed. The diamonds come from Yakutian ground. The workers who extract them live in Yakutian cold. The environmental consequences of extraction, we'll get to those, are borne by the Yakutian landscape. The wealth distribution does not perfectly reflect this geography of contribution, which is a sentence that could be applied to resource extraction relationships between peripheral territories and central states on every inhabited continent. The gold is a parallel story. Yakutia has been a significant gold-producing territory since the Tsarist era, and gold mining, which involves, in the permafrost context, a set of extraction challenges that have generated their own specialized engineering traditions, continues to be a major industry. The alluvial gold deposits of the Aldan and other river systems have been worked for over a century. The environmental footprint of gold mining in Yakutia, the river disturbance, the silt, the chemical inputs used in processing, is a source of ongoing tension between mining interests and the communities, particularly indigenous communities, whose relationship with these rivers is not primarily economic but cultural and subsistence-based. Yakutia also sits on significant hydrocarbon deposits, natural gas, primarily, with the Eastern Siberia-Pacific Ocean pipeline system passing through the territory and representing a piece of the broader Russian energy infrastructure that has become, in the last decade, significantly more geopolitically significant as European markets have shifted away from Russian gas and Asian markets have become correspondingly more important. The development of these gas resources, and the infrastructure required to extract and transport them across permafrost terrain, is a major ongoing project whose economic significance to both Russia and Yakutia will shape the territory's development for decades. All of this resource extraction is happening against the backdrop of the most significant environmental development in Yakutia's recent history, and possibly in its entire human history. The permafrost is thawing. We touched on this in our geological section, back near the beginning of tonight's journey. Remember the troubling numbers about carbon locked in frozen ground? But in the context of modern Yakutia, the thaw is not an abstract future concern. It is a present, observable, daily reality with immediate practical consequences for the people who live here. The thermokarst, the landscape of lakes, sinkholes, and subsidence features created when permafrost ice melts and the ground above it collapses, is expanding across Yakutia at measurable rates. New thermokarst lakes are forming where solid ground existed within living memory. Existing lakes are growing. The coastlines of the Arctic Yakutian shore are eroding at rates of meters per year as permafrost bluffs that were frozen solid for millennia thaw and slump into the sea. In some communities in the Sakha Republic's northern and coastal regions, houses built on permafrost foundations that were expected to remain stable for the life of the structure are failing, cracking, tilting, becoming uninhabitable within decades of their construction, not because they were poorly built but because the ground beneath them is no longer the ground that was there when they were designed. The response to this from Yakutia's indigenous communities, the Sakha, the Evenki, the Yukagir, the smaller indigenous groups of the Republic's north, is a mixture of alarm, adaptation, and a particular kind of weary recognition. The Saka elders who watch the landscape changing around them have a framework for understanding environmental change that is different from the scientific one but arrives at similar conclusions. Something is wrong. Something that was reliable is becoming unreliable. The land that they knew, that their parents knew, that their traditional knowledge was calibrated to, is shifting beneath their feet in ways that their accumulated wisdom was not designed to address, because nothing in 10,000 years of living here prepared anyone for this specific kind of change at this specific speed. The younger generation of Yakutia is navigating this, along with everything else that being young in the 21st century involves, with the resourcefulness and creativity that tends to emerge when people have inherited both deep traditional knowledge and contemporary educational and technological tools. The Saka cultural revival that began in the early post-Soviet period and has continued and deepened in the subsequent decades is one of the more remarkable stories in contemporary indigenous cultural politics globally. The Saka language, which Soviet linguistic policy had pressured toward obsolescence, is now taught in schools throughout the Republic, used in official contexts, broadcast on television and radio, and increasingly visible as a medium of digital cultural production. The TikTok videos, the YouTube channels, the Instagram accounts, the podcasts in which young Saka people discuss everything from traditional food preparation to climate anxiety to the experience of being Saka in Moscow, which is, apparently, an experience with its own rich and complicated texture. The Elanco, that vast oral epic that we encountered earlier, has become a cultural standard-bearer for Saka identity in the contemporary period in a way that its traditional practitioners might find both gratifying and slightly bewildering. It is studied in schools. It is performed at cultural festivals. There are programs specifically designed to train new generations of Elanco singers, the Olankosits, in a tradition that as recently as the mid-20th century seemed at serious risk of dying with the last people who held it in living memory. UNESCO's designation of the Elanco as intangible cultural heritage in 2005 gave it international visibility and, more practically, access to preservation funding that has supported training, documentation, and performance programs. Whether this institutionalization strengthens or subtly changes the tradition, whether the Elanco sung at a festival stage for tourists and television cameras is the same Elanco that was sung through the winter night in a balagan for an audience who needed it to last until dawn, is the kind of question that cultural preservation movements always have to sit with, and for which there are no clean answers. The film industry that has emerged in Yakutia over the last 2 decades is perhaps the most surprising and internationally celebrated dimension of the contemporary Saka cultural moment. Yakutian cinema, produced in the Saka language, often on minimal budgets, frequently by filmmakers who are working across multiple roles simultaneously out of necessity, has developed a reputation in international festival circuits that is wildly disproportionate to the size and resources of the industry producing it. Films made in Yakutsk have screened at Cannes, at Berlin, at Sundance. Critics writing about Yakutian cinema have reached for comparisons to the Korean New Wave, to early Iranian cinema, to the Romanian New Wave, the cluster of references that critics deploy when they encounter a national cinema that is doing something genuinely distinctive rather than reproducing established international templates. What makes Yakutian cinema distinctive is, not coincidentally, exactly what makes Yakutia distinctive. The landscape, the cold, the particular quality of light and darkness, the weight of the traditional culture pressing against the contemporary moment, the specific texture of life in a place that is unlike anywhere else. The best Yakutian films use their location not as backdrop but as character. The cold is not scenery, it is a presence with agency, shaping what is possible and impossible for the human characters in the same way that it shapes what is possible and impossible for real people in the same landscape. There is something in this that feels true not just cinematically but philosophically. In Yakutia, the environment is not the setting for the human story. It is a co-author of it. The Yakutia Festival, the great summer celebration of Saka culture that we mentioned in passing during our food section, remember the kumis and the summer solstice? Has grown in the post-Soviet period into a cultural event of significant scale and organizational complexity. The main Yakutia Festival, held near Yakutsk around the summer solstice, now draws tens of thousands of participants and has become both a genuine community celebration and a showcase for Saka cultural identity in its contemporary form. Traditional games, traditional music and dance, traditional food, traditional costume, all of it present and practiced, but practiced by people who also have smartphones and streaming subscriptions and opinions about international football. The festival is not a museum exhibit. It is a living event, which means it is also a contested one, debates about authenticity, about commercialization, about who gets to decide what counts as properly Saka, run through the Yakutia conversation the way they run through every living cultural tradition that is navigating the gap between inheritance and invention. The demographic situation of modern Yakutia reflects the broader tensions in the territory's development. The Saka people constitute a majority of the Saka Republic's population. Roughly half of the approximately 1 million people who live in the Republic identify as Saka, with Russians, Ukrainians, and smaller indigenous groups making up most of the remainder. But this majority is recent and in some areas tenuous. Soviet-era migration of workers for industrial projects brought large numbers of Slavic Russians into the territory, and the post-Soviet period saw significant outmigration of these populations as industrial employment contracted and the practical hardships of life in extreme cold became less offset by the Soviet system of benefits and subsidies that had made them tolerable. The net effect has been, paradoxically, a slight relative increase in the indigenous proportion of the population even as total numbers have declined. Rural depopulation is one of the defining challenges of contemporary Yakutian governance. The villages and small settlements scattered across the Republic's vast territory, communities where traditional reindeer herding, fishing, and hunting remain the primary economic activities, are losing population to Yakutsk and to cities outside the Republic in a pattern that accelerates with each generation. The young people who leave for university and don't come back take with them not just their labor but their cultural knowledge, their language fluency, their connection to specific landscapes and specific traditional practices. The communities they leave behind age, shrink, and in some cases reach the threshold at which services become unviable and the settlement is effectively abandoned, a process that has already consumed dozens of Yakutian villages in the post-Soviet period and shows no signs of reversing. The response to this, the various government programs, cultural initiatives, economic development schemes, and individual choices that constitute Yakutia's collective attempt to maintain viable human communities across its enormous territory, is a work in progress whose outcome is genuinely uncertain. There are success stories, communities that have found viable economic niches, young people who have returned from urban education to apply new skills to traditional practices, indigenous entrepreneurs who are building businesses around traditional products and cultural tourism in ways that generate income while maintaining cultural connection. And there are failure stories. Villages that didn't make it, traditions that died with their last practitioners, landscapes that are changing faster than any adaptation strategy can keep up with. The climate dimension adds urgency to all of this that is impossible to overstate. The permafrost that has been the foundation, literally, structurally, economically, of Yakutian life for 10,000 years is the thing most threatened by the warming that is proceeding faster in the Arctic and subarctic than anywhere else on Earth. Arctic amplification, the phenomenon by which warming in polar regions outpaces the global average, due to a set of feedback mechanisms involving sea ice, albedo, and atmospheric circulation, means that Yakutia is warming at roughly 2 to 3 times the global average rate. The consequences of this for infrastructure, for ecosystems, for the carbon budget of the entire planet, and for the specific human communities whose entire material culture is calibrated to a frozen world, are not hypothetical future concerns. They are the daily reality of a territory in rapid, involuntary transition. And yet, in Yakutsk tonight, someone is making a film. Someone is recording a podcast. Someone is teaching their child 3 words in Saka that the child will teach their own child in 30 years. Someone is preparing horse meat stroganina with the same knife technique their grandmother used. Someone is posting a video of frozen breath crystallizing in the air, and for 100,000 people on the other side of the world are watching it and thinking, for just a moment in the brief window before the algorithm moves them along to the next thing, that the world is larger and stranger and more interesting than they remembered. The cold holds. The culture holds. The permafrost, at the edges, does not hold quite as firmly as it used to. But the people, the stubborn, brilliant, ancient, contemporary, traditional, digital, complicated, irreducible people of Yakutia, are still here. Still waking up in the dark. Still making tea. Still going to work. The light in Yakutia in the deep of winter does something that light in warmer places doesn't do. It arrives as a gift rather than a given. In December, in Oymyakon, in the villages along the Lena, in the city of Yakutsk with its tilting Soviet buildings and its TikTok generation and its university students arguing about the Elanco over tea in apartments kept deliberately warm against the pressing dark outside. The sun appears for perhaps 3 hours, not blazing, not climbing, but grazing the horizon at a low angle that turns everything it touches to amber and rose and a particular shade of pale gold that photographers travel thousands of miles to capture and still can't quite reproduce faithfully. Then it sets again, and the dark comes back, immense and clear and full of stars, and the temperature drops another 10 degrees toward whatever the night has planned, and the world becomes very quiet and very still and extraordinarily, almost unbearably beautiful in the way that only things at the edge of what is survivable can be. You have traveled a long way tonight. You started at the very surface of this place, the cold itself, the physics of -71, the way frozen air whispers and crackles, and the way your body begins its quiet emergency protocols the moment the temperature drops below what your biology was designed to handle. You went down into the geological deep, into the permafrost that has been keeping its archive of mammoths and ancient pollen and frozen time for 2 million years, into the bedrock that remembers things that predate life on land. You followed the ancestors of the Saka people as they came north along the Lena River, carrying their horses and their culture and their accumulated wisdom about survival, and watched them transform from visitors into natives, from people who happened to be here into people who could not be fully understood anywhere else. You sat in the warmth of a traditional balagan and learned what food means when food is everything, when the fat content of your evening meal is directly connected to whether you wake up warm in the morning, when the fermented mare's milk at midsummer is simultaneously a pleasure and a ritual and a thread connecting you to ancestors who drank the same thing from the same kinds of vessels on the other side of a vast migration. You held a wolverine fur collar in your imagination and felt, perhaps, some fraction of why the people who developed it were not being superstitious or arbitrary but were being precise, precisely attentive to the specific properties of specific materials in specific conditions, a precision that modern material science has still not fully replicated. You walked through the Soviet period, through the weight of collectivization and the horror of the Gulag and the tilted apartment buildings and the diamond mines and the complicated fiscal arrangements that still shape who benefits from the extraordinary wealth locked in Yakutian ground. You spent time in Oymyakon, the coldest town on Earth, watching a Tuesday morning unfold with the particular mixture of the extraordinary and the mundane that characterizes life in any place where extraordinary conditions have become ordinary through the alchemy of habituation. You met the young woman with the beadwork earrings and the TikTok account and the grandmother who knows the Elanco, and you understood, perhaps, something about what it means to be a person rather than a symbol, to contain multitudes without contradiction, to be ancient and contemporary simultaneously, to love a place that is difficult the way you love difficult things, which is to say completely and without requiring them to be easier than they are. All of that is behind you now. The journey has been long and the night has moved on, and somewhere in the course of it, in the geological deep time or the mammoths or the wolverine fur or the frozen banana that drives a nail, something may have loosened in you, some of the held tension of the day, some of the noise that the waking world generates and that we carry with us into our beds like sand tracked in from a beach, present everywhere, requiring effort to notice and more effort to remove. The stories of people who live at the extreme edges of what is possible have a particular capacity for this kind of loosening. They put the ordinary difficulties of ordinary life into a perspective that is not diminishing but is somehow clarifying, like the cold, clear air of a Yakutian winter morning that hurts to breathe but makes everything visible with extraordinary sharpness. So let the cold settle now. Not the dangerous cold. Not the cold that demands response and preparation and the careful management of layers and exposure time. The imaginary cold. The story cold. The cold that you have been visiting from the safety of your warm bed, your warm room, the warm ordinary miracle of a heated space that you probably didn't think much about today, but that is, by the standards of most of human history and by the standards of the people we've been spending this evening with, an extraordinary luxury. Let that cold be what it is, beautiful, enormous, indifferent, and at a comfortable remove. The stars over Oymyakon are very bright tonight. They are always very bright there, in the winter dark, because there is almost no light pollution in the Oymyakon Valley. The town is too small and the surrounding landscape too vast and empty for human light to make much impression on the sky. The Milky Way stretches across the valley like a road made of light, and the aurora, tonight, is beginning to move at the northern edge of the sky. It starts as a faint green smear, easily mistaken for cloud, but clouds in this cold tend to mean weather and there is no weather tonight. The air is still and clear and brutally cold and the smear brightens, resolves, begins to move with that particular quality of aurora motion that is unlike the motion of anything else. Not the movement of wind or water or any mechanical thing, but something more like the movement of thought, fluid and purposeful and impossible to predict from moment to moment. The Saka see their ancestors in the aurora. The physics sees charged particles following magnetic field lines. Both of these things are true in the way that all deep true things are true. Not exclusively, not in competition, but in the way that a river is both water molecules following gravity and a boundary between ecosystems and a highway for fish and a source of drinking water and a place where a child learned to swim and a feature on a map and the sound of moving water that someone hears in their dreams for the rest of their life long after they've left the place where they heard it. The river is all of those things. The aurora is all of those things. You are, tonight, all of the things you have always been plus something slightly new. A person who knows a little more about a place at the edge of the world where people wake up every morning in the dark and go about their lives with a competence and a rootedness and a relationship with difficulty that is, in its own quiet way, one of the most hopeful things about the human species. The horses in their enclosure at the edge of the village are settling for the night. They do this with the practicality of animals that have been settling for Yakutia nights for centuries. Gathering loosely, sharing body heat, their thick winter coats doing the work that their extraordinary cold-adapted biology has prepared them to do without fuss or complaint. Their breath rises in small clouds above the enclosure fence, visible against the aurora light, and then the cold takes it and it is gone. The horses do not watch the aurora. They are incurious about it in the way that perfectly adapted creatures are incurious about their environment. Not because it isn't remarkable, but because remarkable is just what the world is, and there's no particular utility in being astonished by it when you could be conserving warmth. Inside the houses of Oymyakon, the stoves are banked for the night, holding their heat with the efficiency of well-maintained systems that people have learned to trust. The temperature inside is warm enough, not tropical, not the aggressive warmth of an overheated modern apartment, but the particular warmth of a space that has been carefully maintained against serious cold, a warmth that feels earned and intentional and good. People are sleeping. The children who will wake up tomorrow and go to school in -50-something are sleeping the deep, uncomplicated sleep of children whose bodies have not yet learned to lie awake rehearsing their anxieties. The adults are sleeping too, mostly, the particular sleep of people who work hard in demanding conditions and whose bodies know, at the cellular level, the importance of rest. The permafrost beneath the houses holds everything it has always held. The mammoth in its ancient ice, preserved for 50,000 years and waiting for nothing in particular. The charcoal from a hearth fire lit 10 centuries ago by people whose names are not recorded anywhere. The pollen from a flower that bloomed in a summer that no living thing remembers. The cold, dark organic archive of everything that has ever lived and died in this valley, held in suspension, patient beyond any patience that a human being can really imagine. The permafrost does not sleep because the permafrost does not need to. Simply is, as it has been, as it will continue to be for a while yet. We hope. The aurora has moved now to fill the whole northern sky, and it is extraordinary. Greens deepening to occasional violet at the margins, the movement now more rapid, more complex, folding and unfolding in patterns that have no name because no naming system has ever managed to keep up with them. In the village below, nobody is watching. Everyone is asleep, or nearly. They have seen the aurora. They have seen it all their lives. It is their sky, the way the cold is their cold and the permafrost is their ground and the Elanco is their story. Not possessed exactly, but inhabited, lived in, known with the deep familiarity that only comes from a relationship long enough to have moved through wonder and out the other side into something quieter and more permanent. You are nearly there yourself. You can feel the edges of the story softening now, the details becoming less sharp, the cold of the Yakutia night becoming something more like a sensation remembered than a sensation experienced. The horses, the aurora, the stoves, the grandmother with her 300 verses, the young woman with her camera and her frozen breath and her 400,000 viewers who watched, for a moment, and were briefly somewhere else. The permafrost and its patient archive, the diamonds in the deep rock, the mammoths in their long sleep, the children dreaming in their warm beds in the coldest town on earth. Let all of it settle. Let it be what it is, a world complete in itself, extraordinary and ordinary simultaneously, harsh and beautiful in the same breath, like so many of the things most worth knowing about. Let the cold be the cold. Let the dark be the dark. Let the stars be as bright as they are over the Oymyakon Valley tonight, which is brighter than you have probably seen them in a long time, and let that brightness be the last image you carry with you into sleep. Not the thermometer reading, not the survival statistics, not the geopolitical complications of diamond revenue distribution, but just the stars, very bright, very still, over a valley where people are sleeping who know how to live in a place that should not be livable and do it with a grace that is worth traveling a long way to witness. The cold outside your window tonight, whatever cold there is, wherever you are, is nothing. It is barely a suggestion. You are warm. You are safe. You are horizontal, which is, in the final analysis, an excellent state for a human body to be in. The world is doing what the world does, turning slowly, in the dark, taking everyone on it along for the long ride whether they're awake for it or not. Sleep now. The permafrost will keep. The aurora will keep. The Elanco will be sung again tomorrow by someone who learned it from someone who learned it from someone, all the way back to the beginning of the knowing of it, and it will keep being sung long after tonight is a memory that only the ice remembers. The whisper of the stars is the last sound you hear, that soft crystalline crackle of frozen breath in frozen air, the sound of the cold doing what the cold does, the sound of a world at the edge of what is possible, still, somehow, beautifully, improbably alive. Sleep well. You've earned it.